A body may be attached to a chassis or a subframe or some other supporting member. But whatever the case, the tester needs to check all of the fixings, and that includes all the securing bolts, rivets, welds, etc. of those fixings.
What are the reasons for rejection, Tom?
The vehicle will fail if excessive displacement of the body relative to the chassis might lead to loss of control of the vehicle when driven, or there is insecurity of the body or supporting chassis so that it is clear there'll be a danger to other road users.
How about the condition of the body or chassis around the mounting points?
Well, the tester will need to check for the usual: deliberate modification, excessive corrosion, damage, cracks, or inadequate repair, which seriously reduces the strength within 30 centimetres of the body mounting.
But we're not talking prescribed area here, are we?
No. With all body security defects, the vehicle should only be failed if the cumulative effect of the defects is likely to significantly reduce the overall security of the body.
So what about the condition of the body itself?
Oh, this is a nice simple check, Robert. Testers are required to check the body for damage or corrosion resulting in sharp edges that are likely to cause injury or danger to other road users, and that includes pedestrians.
That is simple, Tom. And what about those vehicles that have a spare wheel attached to their outside? Are they testable?
They certainly are. Any externally mounted spare wheel and its carrier must be checked, and as you'd expect, if either are likely to fall off, it will fail. Question, Robert. What type of structure is this vehicle?
Oh, well, like most modern cars, Tom, it's a monocoque.
That's right. So how do we assess its condition? Remember the corrosion film?
I do. Corrosion within 30 centimetres of a prescribed area.
Yeah, but that does not apply in this section.
Really?
Under body and structure, we're looking outside of those prescribed areas. Yeah, we're checking for deliberate modification, excessive corrosion, fracture, damage, inadequate repair in a load-bearing or structural member, which adversely affects the brakes or steering by severely reducing its strength or continuity. There's no maybe or likely here.
And I guess that's the same for Class 5s?
Unfortunately not. The overall message is similar, but the Class 5 manual refers to corrosion, fractures or deformation of main and cross members, plus insecurity of flitch plates and fastenings, the cumulative effect of which makes the vehicle dangerous. Also, any weld breaking away is not acceptable.
What about VINs then? I know from previous films that most vehicles need to have one.
Right, vehicle identification numbers are required for motorbikes, first used from the 1st of August 1999. For all other classes, the relevant date's 1st of August 1980. Testers need to bear in mind that VIN's not required for kit cars and amateur-built vehicles.
How do they need to be displayed, Tom?
Right, it must be stamped or etched either on the body or chassis, or alternatively, there could be a VIN plate somewhere on the vehicle.
And for bikes, then, the plate could be secured or the number etched onto the frame?
Yeah, that's right. And in the case, that could be the same in the case of a trike or a quad. Let's go and have a look at a VIN location.
Now, Tom, this VIN number is very clear, but what if the tester can't find one?
If the VIN's not permanently displayed or legible, it will fail. However, if the tester cannot find the VIN, they should advise the presenter of where its likely location is and get them to search for it. If it still can't be found, the presenter should contact the nearest vehicle registration office.
And if there are two different VINs, I guess the vehicle fails?
Normally, yes. But occasionally a tester may come across a vehicle that's been part of a multi-stage build. Now these can have legitimately two different VINs.
So that would be like an AMG Mercedes or some motor caravans where modifications made at the manufacturing stage before the vehicle is sold as new.
Exactly. And the second or subsequent 17-digit VIN will be displayed on an additional plate. The tester should use the last stage VIN for the MOT documentation.
OK, what next?
Right, I think we've thoroughly identified this, Robert, so let's see about getting in it. The doors.
OK.
All doors need to latch securely in a closed position. Now, in the case of Class 5, all driver, passenger and emergency doors need to be checked to ensure that they can be opened from both inside and outside the vehicle.
And that doesn't apply to Class 3, 4 and 7 vehicles?
It's slightly different for 3, 4 and 7. Only the driver and front passenger door can fail if they cannot be opened from both inside and out using the relevant control. Now then, that reason for rejection does not apply to vehicles that have been modified to carry high-value cargoes, like an armoured security vehicle, for example. The same goes for a passenger door aperture that's been permanently filled, provided there's no obvious aperture gaps. Customised vehicle, for example.
And of course there are vehicles out there that have no door handles.
There certainly are. And if the door handles are not fitted owing to original design or deliberate modification, they should not be rejected, provided they can still latch securely in a closed position.
And what about the tailgate? Is that testable?
Yes, it is, but that comes under the heading load security.
OK, what are the criteria?
Similar to doors, really. Any boot lid, tailgate, loading door, hinged tailboard or drop side has to be able to be secured in a closed position, taking into account any design characteristics.
And I've seen tailgates tied up with string.
Any component held by temporary fixings, such as rope or string, is not acceptable. Well, there's one other thing on Class 5 vehicles. Access panels also need to be checked.
OK, so where next?
Well, although the horn is covered in Section 1 of the Bike and Car manuals, it's actually in Section 6 of the Class 5 manual, so let's talk about that.
OK, now, all vehicle types are required to have a horn, but are the requirements the same?
Pretty much. The horn control must be accessible to the driver, and obviously the horn has to work.
And it has to be loud enough to be heard by other road users?
Yeah, but bells, gongs or sirens are not permitted unless the vehicle was designed before 1905.
Many of those about?
No, and that exemption does not apply to motorcycles. However, bikes first used before the 1st of August 1973 are allowed to have those bulb-type horns.
Oh yes, I had one of those on an old push bike. Any other important dates?
No, but from that date...
That's the 1st of August 1973?
Yep. The horn has to be a constant note and not harsh or grating.
And of course, with a motorcycle without a battery, you'd need to start the engine to test the horn.
Yeah, of course you would. And also if the battery were a bit flat.
I also noticed in the Class 5 manual that it's not just the horn that's in a different section, fuel system checks are as well.
Well spotted, they're in Section 6, whereas in the other manuals it's Section 7, although the items to be checked and the reasons for rejection are the same.
Well, at least that keeps it simple. Where do we start?
Well, essentially, all visible fuel system components need to be checked for security and leaks. And the tester must remember that fuel pipes cannot be fouled for corrosion unless they're actually leaking. It's also important that all checks should be conducted both with and without the engine running.
So the fuel tank and all visible hoses, pipes and unions are included, along with things like the fuel pump, for example?
Yeah, some checks under the bonnet or in the luggage compartment, others during the under-vehicle check.
Apart from the fuel cap, that would be covered in the topside inspection?
Yeah, and we check that the cap can be fastened by a positive means and that pressure is maintained on the sealing arrangement. The sealing washer and flange also need to be in good condition so the spillage of fuel is not possible.
If the tester discovered during the pre-checks that there was no key to open the fuel cap, they should refuse to test.
Yeah, and the same applies to any door, boot lid, tailgate or other device that prevents a proper examination because it cannot be readily opened.
OK. What about checks on the exhaust system? Shall we carry on with those?
That seems logical to me, Robert. Obviously, we can see the majority of the system during our underside check, and generally we would have seen the front end when we were under the bonnet.
And I imagine it has to be both complete and secure.
Yeah, that's it. No parts should be missing or excessively deteriorated. The mountings should all be present and in such a condition that the system is fully supported. You can have alternative mounting devices, they are acceptable, so long as the system is secure and the fixing is not likely to fail.
And you have to check for leaks, obviously with the engine running.
Yes, and any major leak from the system fails, although pinholes and minor leaks are not a reason for rejection.
What about noise, Tom? How does the tester assess that?
Well, that's what's known as the calibrated lug-hole test, Robert.
I'm all ears.
The tester has to decide whether the silencer is in such a condition or of such a type that the noise emitted is clearly unreasonably above the level expected of a similar vehicle with a silencer in average condition.
And is it the same for bikes, trikes and quads?
It's the same for trikes and quads, it's slightly different for bikes. Any leak in the exhaust system that causes excessive noise would be a failure, and not just a silencer. Also, if the silencer were marked with not for road use or track use only or similar wording, that would be a reason for rejection.
And what about exhaust repairs? Are they allowed?
Yep, they're acceptable provided they're durable and the system remains structurally sound.
Tom, this must be one of the world's foremost aircraft maintenance facilities. It's not quite the same as a vehicle garage, is it?
It is one of the best in the world. No, it's not like a garage. But this film's about inspection routine. And here, carrying out a thorough inspection in a routine, that's a vital component in a system that's totally focused on safety.
The MOT test is a safety check that needs to be done thoroughly, so I do see the connection here.
Yeah, it's the routine that's important, following the same pattern every time. That's the best way to ensure that nothing gets missed.
I feel a test coming on.
How perceptive of you, Robert.
This is our vehicle, and the testing station should already have some information about it from when the appointment was made or when it arrived for test, such as make, model, reg number, etc.
Yeah, and usually the class of vehicle will already have been identified. It's normally obvious. However, when the tester carries out the pre-checks, they should ensure that both they and the VTS are authorised to test that class of vehicle. Another thing, if they're not diesel testing, they need to make sure it's not a diesel.
Anything else to consider on pre-checks, Tom?
Yeah, the test equipment must physically be able to accommodate the vehicle. It should be able to get it on the lift or over the pit. Now, this can be an issue, say, with motorhomes or narrow track vehicles.
Oh, yes. And I remember from the diesel films that a bit of maintenance history is handy, including making sure that the cam belt is in good condition.
That's absolutely right. And something that may sound obvious, but the keys must be available for all the locks because they'll need to open everything they're supposed to open to carry out the test. So they need to open doors, that includes side-loading doors, tailgate, boot, bonnet on some vehicles, and the fuel filler cap.
If the test is unable to open any of those, do they refuse to test the vehicle?
Absolutely right. They should also refuse to test in any of the other circumstances that are listed in Section 2 of the introduction of the inspection manual. So, for example, if they think there's a danger to themselves or to others or to the vehicle or to property. And these reasons to refuse to test are also listed in Appendix 3 of the MOT 6th edition guide.
And what are the other reasons to refuse to test? I suppose one must be that the vehicle's incapable of being driven and completing the test, so we need to ensure there's sufficient fuel and oil, for example.
Yes, we do. Also, other reasons to refuse to test: the vehicle or any part of the equipment may be so dirty that it makes an examination unreasonably difficult. It could be that the exhaust produces substantial quantities of avoidable smoke.
OK, that's fairly obvious. What about any documentation that's needed for the test?
Documentation's not normally required, but you could have a vehicle, say, that has a cherished registration number, or it could be that the year letter of the registration doesn't make it clear what standard needs to be applied. Seatbelt requirement on a D prefix plate, that's a good example. Now, the presenter may need to produce the registration certificate, and if it's not available, the tester could refuse to test. However, it's worth checking the MOT database because that may have the information.
And I know some test stations charge a fee up front. Does the presenter get their money back if the garage refuses to test?
Yes, they do. And on the other side of the coin, excuse the pun, if a testing station asks for the fee in advance and they don't get it, that's a reason to refuse to test.
That's fair enough. What about vehicles with foreign number plates or unregistered vehicles? The tester's surely going to need some details to enter the test on the VTS device.
That's correct. The registration, VIN, chassis or frame number, these are all needed. And if they're all missing, illegible, or they contain letters that are not part of the English language, these are a reason to refuse to test because the tester wouldn't be able to identify that vehicle.
And does the tester enter the refusal to test details on the VTS device?
Only if the presenter requires written confirmation does the tester need to register it. And then they would have to produce a VT30 that clearly showed the reasons why they couldn't carry out the test. And then, of course, they would abandon the test.
And what about these circumstances you described earlier where there's no legible VIN or registration mark?
Right, in that situation, they would need to complete a VT30 by hand and put as much detail of the vehicle on as they could, and then they would have to keep a copy.
Okay, having established that the vehicle is fit to test, I guess the tester enters it on the VTS device and is then ready to begin the inspection routine. But what routine does the tester follow?
Right. To help the tester, there's two diagrams in the inspection manual of the recommended routine. There's the top side and the underside. And this information is also available on the VTS device. The routine can be followed in most every situation, but the layout of some test stations doesn't suit it, as does the design of some vehicles, for example, quads. The important thing to remember is that the tester has a sound inspection routine and they keep to it. Now we'll register the test, print off the VT40 checklist, and we'll start our inspection routine in the driver's seat. Remember, only the tester who registered on the VTS device can carry out that test. After you've finished your checks from the driver's seat, get out and move around to the front near side. Cross the front and then down the off side, working your way to the rear, checking in the passenger compartment as you pass. Then move across the rear, checking outside and then inside the boot or cargo area. Now move down the near side to the front of the vehicle, repeating the checks done on the off side, and finally finish with the under-bonnet check. If it's all right with you, I'll go this side.
Good idea.
Here we are inside the vehicle. I've got my VT40 MOT inspection checklist. It's got all the relevant information about the vehicle and the vehicle-specific information. Some testers ask, when they're using this checklist on the back on different items, do they need to tick all the pass and fail boxes? Well, no, they don't. But this document is ideal for recording failure items and advisory items.
This isn't actually going to be a real test, though, is it?
No, we'll be concentrating on the routine rather than specific details of testable items. As you well know, there's good information that focuses on sections of the inspection manual that's contained in the back catalogue and subsequent DVDs that have been produced for MOT matters.
I suppose one of the most important things about an inspection routine is that by doing things in a methodical order means that test items are less likely to be missed.
That's exactly the point of it. There are just so many things to check on a test that items could be missed. But following that recommended routine in a logical progression, we find it works very well to safeguard against missing items.
So where do we start in here, Tom?
Right, well, you've probably heard me say this many times. I'll try and say it differently. Throughout this process, I'll be checking presence. Is the component there? Security, how well is it fixed? The condition of the component, satisfied with all of that, check the operation. Of course, you'll do this very quickly on most items. Lots of testers, once they're sat in the driver's seat, will have different points from where they start their check. For me, it's as far as I can go over to the near side, and I'll be checking, does this door open and close from the inside? That brings me up to the rear view mirror, check that, and then onto the windscreen. Coming across the windscreen brings me to the interior mirror, and then to this side of the windscreen, checking that the sun visor is secure. And then I come down to the view in this mirror and then check that the door is secure in a closed position. And then switch on the ignition. And at that point I can check for such things as, say, ABS lamp. And now I can operate the washers and the wipers. And that completes that check in terms of the view of the road. Then that brings me to light switches. I can operate the light switches, dip, main beam, rear fog telltales, then onto the indicators. Yep, and then that brings me down to hazards, checking with the ignition on this vehicle. I'll check the horn, turn the ignition off, check the hazards with the ignition off.
Now, this vehicle hasn't been modified, but the test applies to disabled driver controls, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. However, if those disabled controls are additional to the normal controls and they and their fittings don't adversely affect the operation of the normal controls, then they would not be a testable item. Otherwise, They're just tested in the normal way. And that information can be found in paragraph 7 in the section how to use the manual. For me now, I move on to the foot brake and or service brake, and I carry out all the checks on there, and then I start the engine up, complete that dip check. Then I move on to the park brake and carry out all the checks on the park brake and its operation and all the prescribed area that I can see from inside the vehicle. I leave the park brake in the off position, check the condition of the steering wheel and the column and the top bush, go through the process. I can never see the road wheel, I've never been able to, so step out. Oh goody, the door opens, that's handy. And then just check the free play on the steering.
Would you do power steering now as well?
Yes, we have the engine running to cover that, and I would feel it, the movement, feel the effect of it. Now I can turn the engine off.
And then what about any steering coupling and the foot pedals themselves?
Right, for me, I'll do that check now. I've got my torch here, always at the ready, and I can check up in here, looking at all of those components, and also up in here, there's going to be most probably prescribed area that I can look at. A lot of testers prefer to do that check when they raise the vehicle, say on a hoist, about halfway, but I do it this time. And that prescribed area then brings me round to the inner sill and the doorstep, the B-post, right up through to the top. Then I'll check the security of the seat, particularly the seat back. And on this seat, the seat belt is integral to the seat. So then I check the condition of the seat belt and its operation and couple it up with the seat unoccupied. Step outside the vehicle, close the door, and that's me finished. Now you can stay where you are, Robert, or you can grab my checklist for me and join me around the front of the vehicle.
I'll do that, Tom. Okay, Tom, this test facility has got convex mirrors, so it's possible to actually check the lights by sitting in the driver's seat. If the bay didn't have mirrors, we'd need an assistant here, wouldn't we?
Yes, you would. And the important thing to remember is that the tester must check all the items and make the observations and decisions about pass or fail. We talked about the checks we do on components, present security, and so on. On lamps, we do all of that. We also check if they flicker when tapped lightly by hand, and we check the interaction between lamps.
And would you do the aim check here too?
Yes, we would here, using the authorised equipment, because that's the way this is laid out. But a lot of test bays are laid out differently, and so maybe you'd be doing the headlamp aim later on during the test. Right, what else would we check while we're at the front of the vehicle?
Well, the front number plates, certainly, and sharp edges, perhaps caused by damage to bodywork or trim.
Yeah, and those sharp edges caused by damage or corrosion, we would check that on the entire body as we went around the vehicle. Now I move across to the offside. When I'm round in this position, first thing I'm going to do is check the shock absorber bands.
And when you're checking the damping effect, you do need to be careful not to damage the vehicle, right?
Yes, that's why it says in the inspection manual that the tester can pull down from underneath if they've got any concerns. Now at this point, a lot of testers will then start to carry out checks on the tyres, particularly the size and type.
And on a class 5 to 5 or 7 vehicle, you also need to note the load and speed ratings as well as the tyre size and type.
Yes, you do. I don't start my tyre checks here. I prefer to do that when the vehicle's raised on the hoist and also when it's raised on the jack. Then I move along here, checking the body condition. There's a side repeater lamp here. Move on to the wipers, condition, security of the wipers. And then that brings me to the mirror. Now, when I was inside, all I checked was the view in the mirror. Now it's a security, and I can see that the mirror is functional. Come along this part of the vehicle. We checked the door before. We've checked all that area, so it brings me straight on to the rear door. And I can check this rear passenger door, that it's securely latches, then open it completely. Got my torch here. We can check the back of the B-post. And along the doorstep and up the wheel arch, checking prescribed area for corrosion and so on. And we can check the inner sill and the floor pan. also prescribed area. And then security of the rear seat back, and then check the seat belts, going through that process, and that completes that part of it. Just close the door. And then check the tyre if that's the way you do it. That brings me to the fuel cap. Just open that, remove the cap, check the seal, put it all back in again, close it. And then it's the shock absorber dampen effect, and that brings me to the rear off side of the vehicle.
And at the rear, we check the lights, Tom, as we did at the front, unless we've already done that from the driver's seat using the mirrors, in which case we still need to check for flicker and security.
Exactly right. Anything else?
Presence of rear number plate and illumination, and then into the boot.
Yeah, and we check the boot or tailgate is securely latched in the closed position, which it is. We open the tailgate.
And Tom, would you lift the carpet up here to do this check?
If it was loose or didn't require any dismantling, so for example this vehicle, it's designed to lift up, so we can raise it up and we can check all the prescribed area. This has also got little pockets at the side, which are, once again, you just flick the little catch and you could get your torch, you can look in there. There could be corrosion around suspension points, security of shock absorbers, maybe fuel devices. You might even see some seatbelt attachments in there. But you can see as much as you can, yeah? Come right round, checking around the whole boot area, another little cover here, and finally get round to this point. Then you can just place that back in. Easy as that. Close the tailgate.
And then you're back at the near side, so down the near side you do all of the checks as you did on the off side, and then you're back where you started.
Yeah, we're back at the front of the vehicle, and at that point we can then open the bonnet and go under and carry on with the under-bonnet checks.
Okay.
Right, now we can start the under-bonnet checks. Before I left the driver's seat, I would have released the bonnet catch. I just raised the bonnet there. And once again, systematic's the name of the game. Now I'm going to carry out checks without the engine running. So there's no health and safety implications. It's quite safe to do this work. Yeah. Got my torch here. Just start at this point and just follow around, checking components and the brake pipes and checking prescribed areas, suspension, coming right round. Then any fuel devices without the engine running, around brake components, just following around prescribed area, coming around to this point, chassis or VIN number, and then just following around. So I've completed a circle, checking all those components.
And Tom, at some point, you need to start the engine and perhaps use an assistant, yes?
Yeah, that's good timing because that's that point. Now if this were being used as an automated test lane, then I would have to start the engine, go around, start the engine, and I'd apply the brake pressure applicator, the pusher. So I've then got the brake components under pressure. And then if I was using an assistant, they would start the engine for me and they would put the brakes under pressure. And I'd check those brake components and I'd check the fuel devices with the engine now running. So I've gone round, repeating that circle. And then I'll have the steering rocked under load. Covers the engine's running, so it covers the eventuality of power steering, and I can check the power steering components. And I would end my under-bonnet check by having checked steering components. Then I would close the bonnet and make sure that it's secured in a closed position. And that's it.
Great.
Next, we have the underside routine. Start at the front of the offside front wheel. Work across the front of the vehicle, and then across an imaginary line between the front wheel centres. Then continue in what is a figure of 8 down the offside to the rear, and then around, checking wheels and suspension as you go, finishing at the near side front wheel. As you can see, I like to finish the under-bonnet checks with the steering being rocked under load. Then when I come underside, I start with those same checks, and that gives me continuity.
And as you've still got the engine running, it makes sense to do the checks that you need the engine running for.
Yeah, lots of testers, they like to have a routine where they'll keep the engine running for the minimum amount of time. So they would do all their steering checks, They would have the brakes pressured right across the vehicle, right through to the rear of the vehicle, checking all the brake components, checking the fuel components and pipes, etc., and checking the exhaust system for any major leaks, right from the engine point right through to the tailpipe. And then, of course, they would switch the engine off and start again at the front on their figure 8.
Okay, so what do we need to check here at the front?
Right, all the testable components, really. So we'd start, let's say, doing static checks on steering components, and then checking suspension components, using a lever or bar as they needed to on certain suspension items. For prescribed area, it'd be finger thumb pressure, checking up in those areas, coming across to this side of the vehicle. If necessary, they'd be using the corrosion assessment tool, yeah? Right round, coming back, and to a point behind the front offside wheel.
And as this is an ATL, does that make a difference to the procedure, Tom?
Well, only in that when they're carrying out these checks, because they don't have an assistant, they're obviously not instructing anybody, so they would check the steering with the steering play detectors. They've got the pedal pusher applicator on, so they've got all those lines under pressure and the engine's running. They can carry out all those checks I've mentioned on fuel and exhaust and so on. And then for the suspension, they would operate the wheel play detectors to check any play in the suspension. And then, of course, they'd lower the hoist, switch the engine off, and remove the brake applicator. They also make sure that the vehicle is chocked. We'd start from behind this front offside wheel and checking the vehicle structure as we go down, all the prescribed areas, checking brake pipes for security, checking fuel pipes, checking the exhaust system for security, just gradually working our way, as I say, finger thumb pressure, corrosion assessment tool if necessary, and end up at a point in front of the rear offside wheel. Now, what I and most testers like to do at this point is go outside the ramp, and then we'll go back along the sill and check the outer sill for corrosion and all the prescribed areas and so on.
So logically then, you'd check the offside rear wheel and its associated suspension and braking components, moving across the rear of the vehicle to the near side, Tom, and then up the near side, checking all of the items that we checked on the offside.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And of course, if this had rear wheel steering, you'd need to remember to check all of those steering components.
Okay, so that's the figure of 8 check completed. Do we now jack the front of the vehicle?
Yes, we do. And I mentioned earlier about chocking the wheels. Well, if the park brake were on the front wheels, yeah, we would definitely need to chock at this time and then jack the vehicle up and release the park brake so that we can now make sure that all the wheel bearings are free for checking.
And either way, if we're jacking the vehicle, we need to jack it in the appropriate way for whatever suspension type is fitted.
Yeah, well done. So you're doing that suspension DVD's paid off, isn't it?
Yeah.
And of course, when it's jacked up, we'll carry out all the checks that are required on the front suspension and on the wheel bearings and on the tyres, and then we'll lower it down onto the turn plates or lower it down and move it onto the turn plates. Right. Now we've got the vehicle resting on free moving turn plates, and we'll either have the rear wheels chocked or we'll have the park brake on, and we can carry out the lock-to-lock checks. If this were a vehicle fitted with a beam axle, then we could do these checks when it's raised on the jack. If it were power steering, we'd have to have the engine running in either case.
And once again, if this was a manual setup, you'd use the assistant to turn the steering on full lock.
Yes, you would, but you need to remember that the tester also has to turn the steering wheel from lock to lock so that they can feel for roughness or tightness in the steering.
And you also need to shake and rock the road wheels for the suspension joint checks on non-ATL equipment, don't you?
Yes, and then we jack the rear and carry out the checks on wheel bearings, tyres and suspension before moving on to the brake performance test.
So Tom, we've moved the vehicle off the hoist to carry out our brake test, be that a roller brake tester, plate brake test, or in the case of some vehicles, a decelerometer test.
Yes, and we would follow the on-screen prompts if this was an ATL, or the appropriate procedures in any other case. It's important to make a note of the brake figures because we would need to enter those onto the VTS device.
So that only leaves the emissions test, which is something that needs to be done with the engine hot. So is that something to do at the beginning when the vehicle arrives for testing?
Yes, you could, if you were in a position to do that at the start of the test, and then of course that would save you having to warm the engine up later.
Would the tester ever do a road test?
Well, obviously, unless you've got a really big forecourt and you need to do a decelerometer test, you'd have to take it on the road. But a road test in itself is not part of the test. However, if the tester considered they'd need to check the result of an inspection, they can. In either case, you need to make sure it's safe and that they are qualified to take the vehicle on the road.
And if the tester found any dangerous defects, these need to be explained to the presenter.
That's important. They need to record it in the C box of the VT30 if they were issuing a refusal to test, or on a VT32 if it was a non-testable item.
And the VT32 would also be used for any advisory defects.
It's always good to issue advisories, Robert, and if the vehicle failed the test, then any testable advisory defects would need to be rechecked on the partial retest. Advisory documents are also useful for customers to report other additional items, peculiar things, say for example a seat missing.
So now we come to the final part of our routine, entering the test data and the result on the VTS device and printing out a certificate or a VT30 in the case of a failure.
And if necessary, a VT32 advisory document.
Well, there's clearly a lot to check, and I can see that this recommended routine has been well thought through.
Well, it's stood the test of time, and like in the aerospace industry, safety is paramount. If the routine works for them, it works for us too, and will keep our roads safe from dangerous vehicles.
Lights form an essential safety feature for many forms of transport, generally allowing the driver to see and the vehicle to be seen. In the case of road transport, the correct operation of a vehicle's lights is vital for road safety, and that's why lighting checks are an important part of the MOT test. And that's why I'm on my bike to meet Jake in the MOT Matters studio. Hey, hi Jake.
Hello, Robert.
Hey, hi. Top of the range Audi and a Suzuki commuter bike. We're obviously covering everything in this programme. What about the lights on bikes, Jake? Are there many differences between the checks on a bike compared to the other classes?
Well, for most of the lamps, it's just the same, or at least very similar, but some of the lighting checks actually don't apply to bikes.
What kind of thing?
Well, motorcycles aren't required to be fitted with side repeater indicator lamps, or hazard warning lamps, or even a rear fog light. And for the purpose of the test, the rear registration plate lamp is not a testable item either.
And I know that some motorcycle testing stations will use a headlamp aiming screen rather than a beam tester, but they're not approved for testing other classes of vehicle, are they?
No, you're quite right there. But we're not going to talk about headlamp aim in this DVD. All the lighting requirements for trikes and quads, because they've been covered in previous issues of MOT Matters, and also in the back catalogue DVD that was recently made.
Yeah, I remember making those programmes.
Good. So anyway, listen, Robert, if you'd like to park up your bike, we'll make a start.
All right, then. Well, this is a bit newer than we're used to, Jake.
It is, isn't it? But, you know, this car has some of the latest lighting technology fitted to it that the testers are likely to come across if they haven't already done so.
OK, for the purposes of the test, what lights need to be fitted?
Well, none, actually. You see, if a vehicle doesn't have front or rear position lamps fitted, or they're permanently disconnected or painted over or masked off, there's no requirement for any other lamps or reflectors to be fitted to the vehicle.
Do you really get vehicles in for tests with no lights at all?
A surprising number, actually, but the majority of these will be used for off-road jobs, such as motocross bikes.
Couldn't testing a vehicle with no lights have implications for the tester?
Possibly. So in these cases, a nominated tester would always be advised to issue a VT32 advisory notice to record the details of the situation.
But there must also be exemptions from the fitment of certain lamps, depending on the vehicle's age.
There are indeed, but we'll deal with these and the other requirements as we check the operation of each of the lamps a bit later on.
So I guess we start, as usual, in the driving seat?
Or, in the case of a motorbike, sat astride the machine. But let's take a seat and we'll go through it.
OK. So obviously, Jake, as part of the interior checks, we'll be checking for the presence, condition, security and operation of the light switches.
We will, and that will include the hazard warning light switch and the rear fog light switch. We'll also be checking the switches for the position lamps, the headlamps, dip and main, dip switch, and we check that the lamps illuminate immediately as selected on both main beam and dip beam.
Is the location of the switches part of the test?
In some cases they are, but the the switch for the position lamps and the rear fog lamps must be able to be operated from the normal driving position.
We must also check the telltales for the indicators, the hazard warning lamps and the rear fog light.
That's right, and we must ensure that the hazard warning lights operate by using only one switch and that they operate with both the ignition switched on, as it is at the moment, and with the ignition switched off.
In respect of the indicator telltale, am I right in saying that it doesn't have to be in the form of a warning light on the dash?
You're quite right. It can be an audible warning. Or if at least one indicator is visible on each side from the driving seat, as is often the case on a motorcycle, then no telltale lamp will be required.
And what about the telltale for the main headlamp beam?
Well, that's not a testable item. But if the tester notices that it isn't working during the process of the test, then they should always advise the customer.
And front fog lamps, are they part of the test?
No, they're not. And before we mention it, neither are the reversing lamps. But there again, if the tester notices any non-testable item is defective during the test, then he should always advise the customer or presenter.
And that's it for the checks on the switches. And it's probably worth pointing out that everything we're doing today is a demonstration for the DVD. We're not actually carrying out a test on this vehicle.
No, you're quite right. As you say, we're using an automated test lane setup here. And during the checks on the switches, we could have been checking the operation of the lamps using these conveniently placed mirrors.
Is it only an ATL where you can use mirrors to check the lights?
No, a facility with a one-person test lane setup must have the mirrors fitted as well. And it's also worth noting that any authorised test lane can use mirrors.
So why haven't we done that?
Well, for the purposes of the DVD, we'll use an assistant to go through the lighting checks so that it's a logical sequence and easier to follow. So if we jump out now, we'll move on to the checks under section 1.1 of the inspection manuals.
OK.
OK, we've got Ian sat in the car as our assistant, and we'll ask him to switch the side lights on for us.
So obviously there needs to be 2 front and 2 rear position lamps, one either side as required. But what are the other checks we need to carry out?
Well, apart from having the correct number of lamps, we would check to make sure that the front and rear position lamps aren't obviously incorrectly positioned, that they face the front and rear as appropriate, and that they also show a steady light of the correct colour to the front and back.
Which is presumably white at the front and red at the rear?
Yes, that would normally be the case, but the front lamps can also be yellow if they're incorporated inside a yellow headlamp.
What about any additional position lamps? I've seen some blue ones on my travels, for instance.
Well, only the obligatory lamps will be testable. Any optional lamps won't be part of the inspection. And, of course, this applies to daytime running lights that might be fitted to a motorcycle.
Now, the position lamps on this vehicle are LEDs. If one of the LEDs wasn't working, does that justify a failure?
No, it doesn't, because that would be unreasonable. See, the lamp would still be able to fulfil its function. So provided at least 50% of the light sources are still working, that would be deemed to be acceptable.
And do you apply the same criterion to the other lamps?
Yes, we do. The same equally applies to conventional bulbs where more than one is fitted.
Isn't there a similar 50% rule for position lamps that are partly obscured?
Yes, there is. Provided that 50% of the lit surface of the lamp is visible, then that would be acceptable. And this applies to stop lamps, rear fog lamps and rear reflectors as well. Of course, in any such circumstances, the presenter should be advised.
And we have to tap the lamps to make sure they don't flicker?
Yes, we do. At the same time, we can check that the lamps are secure. It's also important that we operate all the other lamps on the vehicle to make sure that they don't adversely affect the operation of the front and rear position lamps. And you must remember also on motorcycles, this will include operating the horn.
Of course, for a motorcycle without a battery or one that isn't sufficiently charged, it's necessary to run the engine to carry out these checks.
It is, yeah. And it's also important to make sure that the front and rear position lights come on immediately, that they're switched on. But it's worthy of note that a motorcycle fitted with a front headlight, it's not required to have a front position lamp.
What about position lamps on sidecars?
Well, these are classed as obligatory lamps. So if one was missing or didn't meet any of the other criteria, that would be reason for rejection.
And what about a motorcycle that has a front position lamp incorporated in a yellow headlamp and a sidecar? Can the position lamp on the sidecar be yellow as well?
Well, in these circumstances, although the motorcycle does have a position lamp inside a yellow headlamp, the one on the sidecar will have to show a white light.
What about lenses then? I often see lenses that are either broken or are so dirty you can barely see light through them.
Well, lenses aren't specifically mentioned in the manuals, but we have to check that all lamps are complete, in good condition and clean. Before rejecting a lamp, a tester must assess the lamp to see if it's damaged, deteriorated or dirty to such a degree that it can't be seen from a reasonable distance.
What if the lens is damaged and has been repaired, say with tape?
Well, each repair would be taken on its own merits, and you would judge for things like light output, colour, security and the durability of the repair. And of course, the same criteria would apply to all lights on the vehicle.
Seems reasonable. Now, surely we've covered everything to do with position lamps.
Not quite, because some Class 5 vehicles are required to be fitted with end outline marker lamps.
Are they those lamps you see high up on some vehicles?
They are, yes. And they'll also need to meet the same criteria as the front and rear position lamps.
So which vehicles need to have them fitted?
Well, they're required on all Class 5 vehicles that have a width of more than 2.1 metres and were first used on or after the 1st of April 1991.
And where exactly must they be?
Well, the front end outline marker lamps need to be level with the upper edge of the screen or higher. The rear end marker lamps need to be as high as practicable. But it's worthy of note that the front and rear lamps can be combined into one single unit.
Right, shall we move on to the rear fog lamp checks now?
We can, but before we do, it's worth noting that on vehicles fitted with a dim dip headlight system, it's important to have the ignition switched off when checking the front position lamps.
OK, I'd almost forgotten about them.
Right.
So what age of vehicle is required to have a rear fog lamp?
The check applies to the one required rear fog light, which needs to be either centrally mounted or to the offside, of vehicles first registered on or after the 1st of April 1980.
Now, this vehicle only has one, but if there were two rear fog lamps, one either side, and the near side was defective in any way, that wouldn't be a reason for rejection?
No, it wouldn't. In that condition, the tester would pass and advise.
OK, but don't we need to have the headlamps on as well to check the rear fog lamps?
Quite probably, and in some cases you might need the front fog light switched on as well. But it's perfectly all right for the rear fog lamp to work all by itself, independently of any other lamps.
So what are the reasons for rejection?
Well, they're very similar to those that we apply to the rear position lamps, in as much that it has to be present and secure. It has to emit a steady red light, has to be complete, in good working order, so that it's visible from a reasonable distance.
And it will fail if more than 50% of the lamp's light sources aren't working.
Or indeed if 50% of the lamp is obscured. And we must remember, however, that we also have to test this lamp for flicker by tapping it.
Right, so that all that's left under section 1.1 of the registration plate lamps, they must be pretty straightforward.
Well, they're not difficult, you're quite right. But there are differences across the classes.
OK, so what are the differences?
Well, firstly, we don't check the registration lamps on motorcycles at all. And in all the other classes, we switch on the front and rear position lamps, make sure the registration lamps are fitted and working, and then also we tap them to make sure they don't flicker. But we have to remember, in a case where there's multiple registration lamps fitted, any one lamp or bulb not working will be reason for rejection. And there are some additional checks for classes 3, 4 and 7.
What are they?
Well, the lamp is secure, correctly positioned, and doesn't show a white light directly to the rear.
What do you mean by correctly positioned?
Well, so that the lamp is fitted in such a way that it adequately illuminates the registration plate. Now, we have to be aware that on some vehicles, the registration plates may even be illuminated from behind. And that's perfectly acceptable, provided that the registration plate is adequately illuminated.
Well, that must be the lot for section 1.1. Shall we move to the front of the vehicle and look at the headlamp checks under section 1.2?
OK, if we walk to the front, we can go through it.
Jake, this car has got some pretty fancy-looking headlamps, hasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. And these days, more and more vehicles have been fitted with complex headlamp systems that incorporate bend lighting systems or additional cornering lamps.
Which I suppose is intended to provide enhanced lighting when cornering.
That's right. Generally, bend lighting is incorporated within the headlight housing rather than a separate lamp unit. And this provides enhanced lighting at higher speeds than cornering lamps.
So how does bend lighting or cornering lamps affect how we carry out the test?
Well, it doesn't really, because only the obligatory headlights are testable. Now, this won't include any additional lamps fitted for enhanced lighting, nor the operation of any bend lighting systems.
Well, that makes it easier for us. But do all vehicles need to be fitted with headlamps?
Well, obviously, vehicles with no front or rear position lamps don't need them, nor do vehicles first used before the 1st of January 1931.
But if a pre-1931 vehicle is fitted with headlamps, are they testable?
Not on a motorcycle, but in all the other classes, any such headlights will have to meet certain minimum criteria.
Which are?
Well, the requirements are detailed in the information column of section 1.2, which states that where one headlight is fitted, this must dip, or where two headlights are fitted, they either both must dip, or one will dip and the other one will switch off.
Now, the vast majority of vehicles will be fitted with a pair of obligatory headlamps, whereas motorcycles must only be required to have one.
Well, that's true, but some three-wheelers may only be fitted with one headlight. And again, the information column of the inspection manual will give us the criteria. It states that Class 3 vehicles first used before the 1st of January 1972, or on or after the 1st of January 1972, with an unladen weight of 400 kilograms or less, and an overall width of 1300 millimetres or less, require only one headlamp. Section 9.1 gives us further information, and the table on page 2 tells us that motorcycle-derived tricycles only require two headlamps if they're over 1700 millimetres wide.
Quite a bit to remember there, but apart from that, everything else will be fitted with a matched pair of headlamps.
Not quite. There is one other vehicle that may not have a matched pair. Now, a bus first used before the 1st of October 1969 need only be fitted with one dip beam headlamp. And where two are fitted, they still don't need to form a matched pair.
OK, so what's the definition of a matched pair?
Well, the manuals state that in order for headlamps to form a matched pair, they will both emit light of substantially the same colour and intensity and are both the same size and shape so that they are symmetrical to one another. Obviously, on a lot of vehicles, the dip and main beam functions will be provided by a single pair of headlights.
Apart from ensuring that a matched pair of headlamps is fitted if required, I guess we need to ensure that the lamps are secure, that they don't flicker when tapped, and that they're in good working order.
Yeah, and that they're not damaged or deteriorated or dirty to such an extent that the light output is well below that required to illuminate the road ahead, or that the beam image is adversely affected.
And what about the colour of the headlamp beam? I see some that are a bit blue.
Well, the light output from a headlamp should be substantially white or yellow. Now, those that you're talking about with the blue tint are perfectly OK, provided that the light that they produce is predominantly white.
And we must have to check that the main beam lamps dip or extinguish when selected.
That's correct. But small capacity motorcycles aren't required to have a main beam headlamp. Now, the affected vehicles and the information associated with them will be listed in the information column of the Motorcycle Tester's Manual.
Talking of motorcycles, if they're fitted with twin headlamps, do they both have to work on dipped and main beams?
No, they don't. One or both can operate on either beam. And there again, there's an explanation for the requirements in the information column.
Has that concluded all of the headlamp checks then?
Not quite. There's one more thing. When testing a motorcycle, it's important that we check the headlamp is not affected by the operation of any other lamp or the horn.
OK, so now we can walk to the back of the car and look at the stop lamp requirements under section 1.3.
OK, after you.
I assume there's another date to remember in respect of the requirement to have stop lamps fitted.
Well, there's more than one date, in fact. You see, vehicles first used before 1936 aren't required to have stop lamps at all, while vehicles first used before 1971 are only required to have one stop lamp, which must be fitted either centrally to the vehicle or to the offside. However, the inspection applies to all stop lamps fitted, so if a lamp is fitted, it must be tested.
And after 1971, Jake?
After 1971, vehicles have to be fitted with at least two stop lamps, and they should be about the same height and the same distance inboard from the outside of the vehicle.
So is there any limit to the number of stop lamps a vehicle can have?
Well, as far as the test is concerned, you can have as many as you like. But if any additional stop lamp is disconnected, then that item won't be testable. Now, if there's any doubt, we would always give the benefit to the presenter. And in that case, we would pass and advise.
I've seen some American cars where the stop lamps are combined with the indicators.
That's right, but that would only be acceptable on vehicles first used before the 1st of September 1965. Now, after that date, it would be a fail, because the stop lamp would effectively be adversely affected by the operation of another lamp.
Again, I assume all the usual checks need to be carried out for colour, security, condition, not obscured, and facing to the rear. Yeah,
that's spot on. And we also need to check that when the brake is applied, that the brake lights come on, and when the brake is released, that the brake lights don't remain on.
Not forgetting to tap the lamps to check for flicker.
No, I thought I might catch out with that one. You see, we're only required to do a flicker test on motorcycle brake lights and not on vehicles in any of the other classes.
Any other motorcycle anomalies to look out for?
Well, you may have to have the engine running to carry out the checks, but also there are exemptions from the requirements to have a stop lamp fitted on machines where the machine cannot exceed 25 miles an hour or where the engine capacity is less than 50 cc's on machines first used before the 1st of April 1986.
OK, but motorcycles generally have two brake controls. What are the criteria for those?
Well, machines first used before the same date.
The 1st of April 1986?
Yeah. On those machines, the stop lamps have to operate on at least one control. For vehicles registered after that date, they have to work on both controls. But there's a clause about this in the inspection manual, which reads, however, a small number of machines first used from this date were approved with a stop lamp operated by one control. A machine should only be filled if you are certain that it was originally manufactured to operate from both controls.
I suppose some trikes and quads have two brake controls. What are the criteria for those?
Well, if a trike or quad is fitted with two brake controls, then they must both operate the stop lamp regardless of age.
Now, I see there's a section in the manuals for rear reflectors, but there can't be much to check there.
No, well, there isn't much. The checks are generally very similar to those that we've applied to the lamps, including the fact that they're not required on vehicles that aren't fitted with front or rear position lamps.
So apart from those vehicles, we need to check that the correct number are securely fitted, that they're facing to the rear and they're red.
Yeah, and that they're not damaged, deteriorated so as to impair their function.
And the usual rules apply in respect of being obscured?
Correct, but remember, only the obligatory reflectors are testable. Any other additional reflectors fitted aren't part of the inspection.
So that would be one on a motorcycle and two on other vehicles?
That's right, and they have to be mounted symmetrically on a car or down the longitudinal centre line on a motorcycle.
What about a sidecar? Does that require a reflector?
It does, but it doesn't have to be mounted at the same height as the one fitted to the motorcycle.
Are we concerned with the shape of the reflector at all? I believe, for instance, that triangular ones are only supposed to be fitted to trailers.
Well, you're quite right about that, but no. The shape of the actual reflector is not part of the test.
Is it acceptable if reflector tape is used in place of a reflector?
No, it isn't, and there's a note in the manuals to cover this.
OK, so finally we move on to indicators and hazard warning lamps.
Right, so let's start with direction indicators. The checks will apply to all direction indicators fitted, whether they're required or not.
OK, but which vehicles don't require them?
Well, as usual, vehicles don't require them are those that aren't fitted with front or rear position lamps, and there are also some dates to remember.
Which are?
Well, vehicles first used before the 1st of January 1936 aren't required to have direction indicators fitted.
What about for motorcycles?
Well, for motorcycles, they aren't required on machines that were first used before the 1st of August 1986. The inspection manual also lists some other motorcycle exemptions for machines which cannot exceed 30 miles an hour or 50 kilometres an hour, or off-road motorbicycles that are designed to carry only the rider, or off-road motorbicycles with sidecar designed to carry the rider and one passenger in the sidecar.
What's defined as an off-road motorbicycle?
Well, the manual states that it's a motorcycle that's been adapted or constructed primarily for off-road use by reason of its tyres, suspension, ground clearance or otherwise.
So for vehicles that do have them, what are the requirements?
Well, for flashing type indicators, the usual reasons for rejection are applied.
So an indicator missing, insecure, not in good working order, or affected by the operation of another lamp?
Yeah, you've got it. And also we need to check that they're complete and not damaged or so deteriorated so that their function is impaired. And then we come on to colour and flashing rate. Flashing
rate is 60 to 120 times a minute, and the colour must be amber, right?
Generally, yes, but on vehicles first used before the 1st of September 1965, the indicators can be incorporated in the vehicle's brake lights or front position lamps.
So it could have white indicators at the front and red at the rear, like some American vehicles?
Yeah, and the same applies to motorcycles.
What about side repeater lamps?
Well, obviously these don't apply to motorcycles, but otherwise they're required on all vehicles first used on or after the 1st of April 1986.
And have to be amber, right?
That's right. And they might even be included in the front indicator lamp if it's fitted with wraparound lenses.
And how do we identify those?
Well, generally, the lenses are marked up with a capital letter E in a circle or a lowercase e in a rectangle with the number 5 above it.
Well, that's easy enough.
Well, it would be if there weren't some lenses in circulation that weren't marked up with the approved markings.
And how do we identify them as such?
Well, what we'd have to do in that situation is stand about 1 metre to one side of the rear bumper, have the indicator switched on and see if there's an amber light showing from the front indicator lens. And if that was the case, then that would be deemed as acceptable.
No such worries with the old semaphore type?
Well, if you have a vehicle where semaphore indicator types are fitted, you must check that they extend and retract smoothly and show an amber light to the front and rear.
So that's indicators covered. Now what about the hazard warning lamps?
Well, you will definitely come across some hazard warning lights that are fitted to motorcycles, but as they're not a requirement on motorcycles, they won't be part of the test.
But they're required on all other classes after a certain date?
That's right, and they're required on vehicles first used on or after the 1st of April 1986. However, you may find that they're fitted to vehicles registered before this date, and if so, they must meet the requirements for the test.
So obviously the hazard warning device must make all of the direction indicators flash, and as we've already covered, it must have a telltale and also work with the ignition both on and off.
Yeah, that's right, Robert. That just about covers it.
ATLs are a really effective and efficient way of testing vehicles. We can test modern vehicles using modern test equipment in a really effective way without the use of an assistant, and that's where the effectiveness and the efficiency comes in. One-person testing is the natural progression from automated test lanes. It's exactly the same specification, but it does not require the installation of a computer-controlled roller brake tester. So if you're a garage that's recently had a roller brake tester installed, you can continue to use that. Motorcycle decelerometers will be introduced this year, and they will be introduced on a voluntary basis for motorcycle garages. But they're also very, very useful for car garages that test trikes and quads, because with an adapter, you can then test the brakes quite efficiently and quite effectively on those peculiar vehicles.
The introduction of one-person testing, whether using an ATL, automated test lane, or an OPTL, a one-person test lane, means some changes are required to the test procedure, as there's no longer a requirement to have an assistant. Testers should be familiar with the test routine set out in the introduction of the inspection manual. However, testing without an assistant, whilst not deviating from the routine, requires a number of changes to the test procedure, with subtle variations depending on the layout of the test equipment. The tester must ensure that all the testable items are checked in accordance with the inspection manual. But it helps if this is done in a logical and efficient way. This DVD gives guidance on a procedure to adopt.
Firstly affected by the operation of another lamp or the horn.
Brian Gray is a Vosa technical trainer who is going to take us through the test routine for one-person testing. We'll assume that all the pre-checks have been completed and the vehicle registered on the VTS device.
As usual, test starts here in the driver's seat, ensuring that we've put the steered wheels on unlocked turn plates. We'll carry out all the usual interior checks, and we can then do lock-to-lock check to check for any roughness or tightness in the steering mechanism. Not forgetting that if we've got power steering fitted, we must have the engine running for all checks that require steering movement. We strongly recommend that we use exhaust extraction equipment because we're going to have the engine running a lot and all the way throughout the test. We then use the mirrors in the test bay to check the operation, interaction of the lights, not forgetting that we must check the hazard warning lights with the ignition on, the ignition off. When we're finished with the lights, we can turn the engine off. We'll leave the side lights and the rear fog light on. We'll pop the bonnet and we'll get out of the vehicle. Now we're at the front of the vehicle, we can carry out all the usual checks across the front of the vehicle, tap in the appropriate lights to check for flicker. We'll make our way down the offside of the vehicle, checking all the relevant items by the topside routine in the manual. Across the back, tap the lights, check for flicker. Come down the near side. Once we come back to the front, we can lift the bonnet. We can carry out all the relevant checks under the bonnet, fuel system, engine not running, and brakes not pressurised. Having returned to the driver's cabin, started the engine, brought the ramp up to a convenient height, I can now carry out the lock-to-lock checks, checking for components fouling, brake hoses stretching, twisting, etc. I can bring the wheels back to the straight ahead position, lower the ramp, move it onto the wheel plate detectors. With the engine running, we can check for free play in the steering before applying the brake pedal application device. We can carry out the under-bonnet checks on a fuel system, exhaust, power steering, engine running, brakes pressurised. We can then check steering under load using the wheel plate detectors and check for any play in any visible suspension components, again using the wheel plate detectors. Move the vehicle so it's the correct focal distance from the beam setter, align the beam setter to the vehicle, align it to each headlamp in turn, carry out headlamp aim assessment, not forgetting to tap each light, check it for flicker. Raise the hoist, leaving the engine running and the brakes pressurised. The tester can now carry out the underside inspection following the figure of 8 routine as recommended by the inspection manual, using the wheel plate detectors to check steering and suspension components. We'll also be checking fuel system, power steering components, braking system under pressure, engine running as required by the manual. You can then come to the front, jack the vehicle the appropriate way to the suspension type, and then it's an ideal opportunity once it's jacked to check the steering rack gate has expanded, as it's quite easy to turn the wheels lock to lock. We now lower the hoist sufficiently to remove the brake pedal application tool, switch the engine off, bring it up to a convenient height to carry out the remainder of the front suspension checks, remembering to put a bar under the wheel as necessary. It's worth noting that for suspension types figure 3, 3A and 4, as shown in the inspection manual, no need to put a bar under the wheel because all the items can be satisfactorily checked using the wheel plate detectors. We can then carry out checks to the wheels, tyres, wheel bearings, and we shouldn't cause any problem with ABS or traction control because we've got the ignition switched off. It's worth mentioning that the inspection manual allows for wheel bearing play to be checked using the wheel plate detectors, but it's acceptable to do it by hand because we're going to rotate the wheel anyway to check for roughness, so it would make a simple procedure if we did that at the same time. We can raise the hoist again, and then before lowering the jack we can carry out any checks necessary to drive shaft couplings, CV boots, inner sideboard and tyre. We'll lower the front, go to the rear, jack up the rear, allowing the wheels to hang free if possible, and complete the checks to wheel bearings, suspension components and tyres. When that's completed, the only remaining checks for the underside will be the fuel system with the engine switched off and the braking system components not pressurised. For the purpose of the film, we've not covered the emissions test or the brake performance check. Clearly, you can carry out the emissions test at any convenient point during the test, usually at the beginning or the end. The conventional roller brake tester is used in the normal way on OPTL, whereas an ATL brake tester will provide prompts to the tester to guide him through the sequence. Vosa recommends that the underside inspection is carried out first before the brake performance check, so the tester has the opportunity to refuse to test should there be any problem with damage to a vehicle, property or injury to a person. And it's worth as a final point to say that if any time during the test procedure the tester feels he needs the use of an assistant, then he must use one.
An ATL is no longer than a conventional test bay. The hoist is slightly longer to facilitate the wheel play detectors, but Vosa has reduced the distance behind the headlamp beam tester from 1 metre to half a metre. It's important to remember that wheel play detectors can't be fitted to any type of hoist. Consequently, Vosa requires a declaration from the hoist manufacturer that the hoist is suitable for such an installation. Vosa does not accept these declarations from equipment suppliers or installers. To summarise, one-person testing means that the recommended routine is broadly followed, but there are some significant procedural differences. When positioning the vehicle on the hoist or pit, ensure that the steered wheels are resting on unlocked turn plates. Start in the driver's seat as usual and carry out all the interior checks as well as roughness and tightness in the steering. Use the test bay mirrors to check operation and interaction of the lights. Ensure the side lights and rear fog lamps are left on to tap during the topside inspection. Carry out the initial under-bonnet checks with the engine off. Start the engine, raise the hoist and carry out the lock-to-lock checks. Lower the hoist, move the wheels onto the wheel play detectors, leave the engine running and carry out the steering free play check before applying the brake pedal application tool. Complete the under-bonnet checks of fuel, exhaust and braking systems, then check steering and suspension components using the wheel play detectors as necessary. Before jacking the vehicle, carry out the headlamp alignment check. Raise the hoist again and carry out the figure of 8 underside inspection using the wheel play detectors as necessary. Jack the front wheels. Turn the steering on each lock to check steering rack gaiters when they are fully expanded. Lower the hoist, turn off the engine, remove the brake pedal application tool and complete the front suspension checks, using a bar under the wheels if necessary. Check the front wheels and tyres and carry out the wheel bearing checks. Raise the hoist, check CV boots, drive shafts and tyre inner sidewalls. Jack the rear wheels and complete the rear wheel bearing, tyre and suspension checks. Remove the jack and finish the underside inspection with the remaining fuel and braking system checks. Emissions and brake performance checks can be carried out at any convenient point in the procedure.
It's not as complicated as it seems, but whatever routine you use, ensure all testable items are checked and checked correctly.
Parking brakes are either usually hand or foot operated and use cables or rods to apply the brakes either at the front or rear of a vehicle. However, electromechanical parking brakes, often referred to as electronic parking brakes or EPBs, are being widely fitted by many vehicle manufacturers. Vosa vehicle examiner Jake Fawcett is here to tell us more about them. Hello, Jake.
Hello, Robert. You're quite right in what you say. The EPB is becoming an ever more popular feature on a wide variety of vehicles, as we can see in this car park behind us here.
Why is that? Are there advantages over conventional parking brakes?
Well, yeah, apart from saving interior space, which is great for interior vehicle design, they also enhance passenger safety and driver comfort.
Well, spill the beans and give us some examples.
Well, an EPB can be part of an integrated computerised braking system on a car, which can have features added or deleted depending on vehicle design and specification, or even on customer particular requirements. And some of those features are automatic application of the brakes when the vehicle comes to a halt. The EPB automatically applies when the ignition is switched off or when the driver's door is opened. Drive away assist, where the EPB automatically releases on acceleration of the vehicle. Parking brake effort may be automatically adjusted by the EPB electronics to match the requirements of the incline or cooling of the brake discs. Hill hold, and that prevents the vehicle rolling back on a hill until the driver accelerates. Manual release, when the switch or the brake pedal is pressed. Parking assistance if combined with a distance sensor system, incorporated as part of the vehicle's immobiliser. Emergency braking function if the service brake system fails.
Clearly there are a considerable number of advantages then, but what about testing issues that we need to be made aware of?
Well, most vehicles fitted with an EPB can still be roller brake tested. However, the use of plate brake testers and decelerometers will not normally be used.
Is that because of the emergency braking function?
Well, yes. You find that if you apply an electronic parking brake when the vehicle's travelling at just a few miles an hour, it can invoke the emergency braking system. Now that will apply the hydraulic systems on the car and may also operate any ABS or ESP systems fitted to the vehicle.
Anything else to worry about?
Only that testers need to be aware of any other EPB safety features that may be fitted or active at the time of the test.
Such as the EPB applying automatically when the ignition is switched off, which could prevent the tester from carrying out the necessary checks on, say, the rear wheel bearings.
Well, that's the sort of thing, yeah. Similarly, to release the EPB, it'll be necessary to switch the ignition on and maybe depress the clutch or the brake pedal. But that sort of action will be obvious to the tester by virtue of some of the visual prompts from the vehicle dashboard.
So the tester probably needs to establish the EPB operation during the interior checks to facilitate conducting the rest of the test.
That's right. Or he can refer to the vehicle manufacturer's handbook if it's available. But it's important to remember that EPB operation will not only vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, it may also vary dependent on the particular model specification.
For now, though, you're going to show us the most common types, how they work, and any issues that you found with testing them.
Well, I'll do my best.
OK, let's get in and have a look.
Right.
Vehicles fitted with electromechanical parking brakes must surely have fewer items needing to be checked under Section 3.1, park brake lever and associated mountings.
And that's right. As you can see, the electronic parking brake lever on this vehicle is simply this little switch here mounted in the centre console.
Certainly seems straightforward enough.
Yes, it is. All you do is you just flick it up like that to apply the parking brake.
Does the ignition have to be switched on?
Not to apply it, no, but it will need to be switched on to release it.
And to release it, you just press down on the switch?
And that's right, yeah, and as you can see, it just simply returns to the neutral position like so, in the middle there.
Testers will still need to go through all of the relevant checks under Section 3.1 of the manual, won't they?
And that's right, but Section 3.1 refers to the mechanical lever and its operation and its mountings, but in this case that doesn't apply.
What about the location and condition of the switch itself?
Well, Section 3.1 only refers to the mechanical lever and its location. On this vehicle it doesn't apply.
So all of the park brake lever and pull mechanism checks can effectively be ignored?
And that's right. But checks for missing or insecure locking and retaining devices will still apply on the underside inspection, particularly on vehicles such as this that still use cables.
What about checking for fractures, cracks, corrosion and distortion within 30 centimetres of the control?
Well, that doesn't apply to the switch as it doesn't have a load-bearing structure. However, we will pay particular attention to the electric motor mountings underneath as per method of inspection 7.
But still considerably fewer interior checks as far as the parking brake's concerned.
Yeah, that's right.
Whilst we're on Section 3.1, I noticed that method of inspection 2 requires that we check that the parking brake on vehicles first used on or after the 1st of January 1968 are maintained in operation by direct mechanical action only. Do EPBs comply with this requirement?
Well, yes, they do. Although that the EPB is applied by electrical means, they usually incorporate a screw thread or a rack device that ensures that the application of the brake is maintained purely by mechanical means.
So how does it work on this particular vehicle?
Well, the EPB on this vehicle has a spline shaft that is turned by an electric motor via a gearbox. This causes a threaded connector to be screwed in or out of the spline shaft depending on the direction of rotation of the motor. The fact that the spline shaft can move axially in the gearbox equalises the load applied by the inner brake cables to both sets of drum brakes.
OK, and what about vehicles that don't use cables?
Well, we'll have a look at some of those later, but let's put this one on a hoist.
OK, let's go.
Right, here we are underneath the vehicle, and we're going to use this handy piece of equipment here because some of these components are a little bit out of the way, but it'll help us to establish where they are and how they fit into the frame of the vehicle.
Great.
Right, Robert. Now, if we look up here, we can see where the electric motor device is positioned on this vehicle above the rear axle. And here we can see the connection of the conventional cables which will operate the brakes leading out of the housing and into the bodywork of the vehicle here above the axle again. And if we follow these cables down, we can see where they enter the brake assembly in just a conventional manner. The connection to the back plates like that, and it's the same on both sides of the vehicle. OK, so apart from the electric motor up there,
and its mountings and associated connections and components, the operation of the brakes down at the wheel end is just as normal.
So with a system like this, the tester would still need to check any remaining items from section 3.1, the structure around the motor and any retaining or locking devices.
And that's true, and any reason for rejections would still apply. Of course, he'd be checking all visible mechanical components for presence, security, condition and operation in accordance with section 3.5 of the inspection manual.
So nothing much different there. But what about brake efficiency? As this is a four-wheel drive, I assume we can't roller brake test it.
Well, that's a good point, but actually the majority of EPBs fitted to 4x4 vehicles can be tested for efficiency using roller brake testing equipment. However, many of these vehicles may still need a decelerometer test to be carried out to calculate the service brake efficiency.
So can we roller brake test the parking brake on this Land Rover Discovery?
Well, unfortunately, life's not that simple. This may well be fitted with what's known as an active differential, and the manufacturer advises against carrying out a roller brake test on this one.
Well, as you said earlier, EPBs can't usually be efficiency tested using a decelerometer. So does that mean that this vehicle is actually an exception and we can do a decelerometer test?
Well, unfortunately, with this vehicle, it's not quite as simple as that.
I guessed as much. What are the issues?
Well, as with any EPB-equipped vehicle, if the driver operates the EPB control at anything more than just a few miles an hour, the vehicle computer systems will activate the service brakes. And this will make use of any ABS or ESP systems that may be fitted to the vehicle. And this is quite a safety feature.
All very clever, but how are we going to check the parking brake performance then?
Well, OK, what we have to do, we have to set the vehicle in a condition that the manufacturer calls bedding mode.
And how do we do that?
Well, it's quite a complicated system using the braking system, so you'll need to pay attention because I'm going to ask questions later, Robert. Firstly, using a suitable location, we bring the vehicle to a halt using the foot brake. Now we apply the EPB. Then depress the brake pedal 3 times and hold down on the third application. Now this must be completed within 10 seconds. Whilst maintaining pressure on the foot brake, pull the EPB switch 4 times and then press it 3 times. Now this must be completed within 20 seconds. Mode selection will be indicated on the instrument panel by a flashing red light and a mode selection message, Park Brake Bedding Cycle Active. Don't worry if you can't remember that, as you'll find it all in the vehicle specific information. Right, well let's set the decelerometer and give it a try. Now what we need to do is to take the vehicle up to about 20 miles an hour, apply the EPB switch and hold it on until the vehicle comes to a complete stop. But you must remember, if you've got a vehicle fitted with manual transmission, that you dip the clutch just before the vehicle comes to a halt to avoid stalling it.
OK.
Right.
Ready.
Hold it on.
Right, that's reading 27%, so that's easily passed. One further question.
Go on.
On this vehicle, could we have done a plate brake test?
Yes, we could, no problem, provided it's in bedding mode first, that's OK.
OK, and one last thing, how do we get it back into normal mode?
Well, to deactivate bedding mode, we simply drive the vehicle up to 30 miles an hour or 50 kilometres an hour, or just park it up and switch the ignition off.
Well, that's straightforward enough. Let's move on to another vehicle. How about the Renault Scenic?
Renault Scenic it is.
Great. What aspects about the operation of the Renault EPB do we need to be aware of?
Well, the electronic parking brake will apply automatically when the engine's switched off. And also, on models fitted with automatic transmission, the brake won't release if the engine's running and the driver's door is open.
OK, that's useful to know. What about the operation of the switch itself?
Well, that's quite straightforward. To apply the parking brake, we simply lift this control like so. And to release it, we lift the control at the same time as pressing the red button.
And does it use cables to apply the parking brake?
Well, we've looked at all the things inside the vehicle and there's nothing to worry us here, so why don't we lift it up and have a look?
Great. Here's the electric motor as before, with cables operating the parking brake.
That's right, so the items to check in sections 3.1 and 3.5 will be similar to that for the Land Rover.
And what about carrying out the brake performance test?
Well, let's get the back wheels in the rollers and see how it gets on.
OK, I'll lower the hoist, you drive it in.
OK. OK, Robert. The brake performance checks can be carried out in the usual manner, whether using an ATL or a conventional roller set. The only thing the tester needs to be aware of is the correct method of applying the electronic parking brake.
And what is the correct method?
Right, well, when the tester applies the park brake control, they need to hold it in the applied position until either a wheel locks out or maximum effort is actually achieved.
And doing it that way presumably increases the braking force applied.
That's right. Applying the parking brake control in the usual way by just pulling it once and letting it go would normally be sufficient on most occasions. However, the system is designed to apply additional force if you hold the control out and keep it out, and that would be used in situations such as parking a vehicle on a steep gradient.
So no problems at all with the brake test then?
No, it should all be straightforward. Although carrying out a brake test on a conventional roller brake set where you rotate one wheel at a time may bring on a warning lamp. But Renault tell us that this isn't a problem and the system will reset itself once you switch the ignition off.
Good. What about carrying out a plate brake test?
Well, that'll depend on the specification of that particular vehicle. Some are designed to operate the ABS if the electronic park brake control is operated while the vehicle's in motion. So the drive-on speed for the plate brake tester may be an issue for some of the variants.
OK, so what's next?
Let's have a look at something from the Volkswagen Audi group.
OK. OK, here we are in the VW Passat. Is there much difference in testing the EPB on this?
No, not much difference at all. But the tester will need to remember to depress and hold the brake pedal at the same time as he operates the EPB release button.
What if the tester didn't know that and just press the EPB button?
Right, well, you'll actually get a visual display on the dashboard instrument here.
And to apply the brake, you just press the button again?
Yeah, it's simple as that. But the tester needs to be aware that if the vehicle is fitted with a hill hold function, that this is inactive at the time. But however, that shouldn't be such a problem because the hill hold function will deactivate itself once the ignition is switched off anyway.
And does this EPB system use cables like the Discovery and the Renault?
Well, let's lift it up and have a look.
OK.
Right, as you can see, there are no separate motor or cables here, Robert. It's all actually integrated into the rear brake caliper.
So this extra bit on the side houses the electric motor and the other mechanical components that make up the EPB?
Yes, it does. And the electric motor in there drives something called a swash plate gear, which in turn rotates a threaded spindle, which acts upon a thrust nut.
And the direction of rotation of the motor determines whether the thrust nut applies or releases the brake?
That's right, it does, yes.
And does this system cause any problems carrying out a roller brake test?
Not really. The only things we need to consider are whether we're actually using an automated test lane or a conventional roller brake tester. So let's get it in the rollers and see how it does.
OK.
So, if we were using an ATL, we'd have to ensure that the engine was switched off, but the ignition was still switched on. Then, as both rollers run together, the vehicle electronics would pick up on that, and as it noticed that the rear wheels were turning and the front ones weren't, it would automatically set the vehicle into park brake test mode.
And that's to prevent activation of the emergency braking function?
That's right, yeah.
How can we be sure that it's gone into this test mode?
Well, this condition can take up to 7 seconds to set. Then normally a warning tone would sound, and the instrument panel would display a message saying park brake test mode. On some models, it may even bring up a brake malfunction warning light.
An indicator lamp like that could be a bit worrying for a tester.
Well, that's right, it would be. But there's no cause for alarm here because you're not actually causing any damage. And the indicator warning lamp will reset itself once the ignition's been switched off.
So the parking brake switch can then be applied in the normal way to check the efficiency?
Yeah, well, not quite. In test mode, the electronic park brake switch has a progressive operation and may need to be operated up to 4 times.
And that's to achieve the maximum possible performance, like holding the switch out on the Renault?
Exactly right. Of course, lockup may occur before this, but if it doesn't, the tester must remember to operate the switch 4 times in order to achieve maximum efficiency.
And when we've finished the test, how do we get the EPB out of test mode?
No problem. As soon as the vehicle is out of the rollers, the brake function warning light will go out and the car will automatically deactivate park brake test mode.
Is this system used on all VAG Group vehicles fitted with an EPB?
Well, it should be very similar, but its operation may depend on the safety features that are specified for that particular vehicle. The electronic parking brake system fitted by Bentley also works in very much the same way as this.
OK, so that covers an ATL test on this system. What about a conventional roller test?
Well, that's even more straightforward. We still need the engine off and the ignition on, but because we're only running one roller set at a time, it won't go into test mode.
So what happens when we apply the parking brake?
Well, because we're not now in test mode, the parking brake will apply to a maximum effort with just one application of the control button.
And then we release the EPB and do the same with the other wheel?
That's exactly right.
And does testing with a conventional roller set cause the brake malfunction indicator light to come on?
Well, it shouldn't do, but don't worry if it does, because the manufacturer assures us you're not causing a fault, and the system will reset itself once the ignition's been switched off.
Well, that's good news. What about using a plate brake tester to test the parking brake?
Not possible, I'm afraid. You see, the necessary drive-on speed for a plate brake tester may cause the hydraulic brake circuits to activate and not the park brake.
So if the VTS only had a plate brake tester, they'd have to decline to test the vehicle as their equipment isn't suitable, as it states in the introduction of the inspection manual.
Yeah, that's correct.
So what's next?
Well, to be honest, other systems don't differ too much from what we've already looked at today. For instance, the S-Type Jag doesn't differ too much from the Renault system we've looked at, in as much as they both use cables to apply the brake.
This speed limiter check sounds complicated.
No, it's quite simple, really. Let's start with those that can be in both Class 4 and 5. This check only applies to vehicles with more than 8 passenger seats, with a maximum speed over 100 km/h, that's around 62 mph, if a speed limiter were not fitted.
Then there are some dates to think about. For vehicles with design gross weight exceeding 7,500 kilos, a speed limiter will be required if it was first used on or after the 1st of January 1988. For vehicles with a design gross weight that doesn't exceed 7,500 kilos, a speed limiter is only required on vehicles first used on or after the 1st of January 2005. Irrespective of class, a slight complication is that vehicles with a design gross weight not exceeding 7,500 kilos with a Euro 3 or later engine are required to be fitted with a speed limiter if they were first registered between the 1st of October 2001 and the 31st of December 2004.
Testers are not required to identify these vehicles, but if it's obvious a speed limiter is fitted, then it must meet the requirements of the inspection. Class 5 vehicles with more than 16 passenger seats, with a maximum speed in excess of 70 mph, which is just over 112 km/h, and with a design gross weight exceeding 7,500 kilos, will require a speed limiter if they were first used between 1st of April 1974 and the 31st of December 1987.
The design gross weight can be found on the manufacturer's plate, but what about earlier vehicles that don't have one fitted?
Right. In those cases, the tester will need to work out the calculated laden weight. This simply involves multiplying the maximum number of passengers and crew by 63.5 kilos and adding that to the unladen or curb weight of the vehicle, which can be found marked on the side of the vehicle.
So tell me about the speed limiter plate.
Right. This needs to be securely fixed in the driver's compartment in a conspicuous position. It can be read from either inside or outside the vehicle, but if it faces outwards, it needs to be able to be read by a person of average height, so it cannot be too high.
And naturally it must show the speed at which the limiter has been set.
Yeah, we're not concerned about the composition of the plate or the size of the lettering, but it must be clearly and indelibly marked with a set speed, which can be in mph or kph.
And I assume the vehicle will fail if the plate is showing a set speed greater than is permitted.
Yes, and also if it's missing, insecure, or not in a conspicuous position.
Do we have to check the speed limiter itself, Tom?
We do, but only those parts that are readily visible without dismantling.
Of course, but what can it be failed for?
Obviously, if it's not fitted or insecure, or if any of the cables or actuating rods are damaged or disconnected to the extent that the speed limiter is clearly affected.
And what about the wiring?
If the wiring is disconnected, that's an obvious fail, but it will also fail if it can be easily disconnected by unauthorised means.
I believe some speed limiters are wired through the ignition switch. Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine, but any other devices that can enable the limiter to be switched off while driving are not acceptable.
Surely the limiters are designed to be tamper-proof.
Yes, they are, and any tamper-proof device missing, defective or showing signs of having been disturbed should be failed.
Okay, but what does a tamper-proof device look like?
Well, you might ask, Robert. Many are mechanical or electrical devices that require special tools, which are usually only available from vehicle or component manufacturers. Most modern vehicles use electronic devices that are simply not possible to check.
So is that all there is to it?
Pretty much. But testers may be faced with presenters who claim that their vehicle's been modified. For example, the rear axle ratio has been changed, so it's no longer capable of exceeding 100 km/h.
And what happens then?
The presenter must produce a signed declaration stating the specific reason why the vehicle is no longer capable of exceeding 100 km/h, and the testing station should then keep that declaration for 18 months.
So more paper to clutter up the place?
I'm afraid so. Today we're just going to talk about the checks on suspension. Obviously we won't ignore steering where it's relevant, because we'll be taking a look at steering in a future programme.
Now the manual has diagrams of various suspension types, doesn't it?
But it's just as you say, Robert, they're diagrams. When you're under a vehicle, it's not always easy to identify the various types. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show the different types from under a vehicle and then discuss all the issues relating to suspension. But of course for that we'll need test equipment.
Okay.
Right, as usual, before we start, there's a few things we need to know. Firstly, equipment, a suitable pinch bar for checking for wear and play, a pitot hoist where the wheels can be jacked, and don't forget, you may need to use the corrosion assessment tool.
And Tom, obviously this covers front and rear.
Yes, it does.
Can we just go back to the equipment for a moment?
Yeah.
You wouldn't need a pinch bar on an automated test lane, would you?
I am glad to see you're keeping up to speed, Robert. Right. Although the wheel plate detectors shake the suspension, you may still need to use the pinch bar because the wheels will need to be jacked.
And what about the differing suspension types on an ATL?
That's not a problem. It can be used on all types.
And do we need an assistant, Tom?
Yes, although we'll be using here ATL, we'll be using it in manual mode. Now, if this were a real test, the assistant would be in the vehicle now, ready to help with steering and brake checks.
Wouldn't you test the shock absorbers with the vehicle on the ground, Tom?
That's quite right, and most testers would check for the damping effect during the topside inspection, and they'd look under the bonnet and in the boot for any suspension attachments. Now, there's something else I need to explain here. Always take care pushing down on the corners of the vehicle when checking for the damping effect. It's really important that nobody gets hurt and no damage is caused. As an alternative, testers can pull down on the vehicle during the underside checks.
And I believe some vehicles were actually built without any shock absorbers.
That's true, and it's only a failure if they don't have any when there were shock absorbers originally fitted.
What else are you looking for on shock absorbers? Security, corrosion, damage?
Yes, we are, and we're also looking for excessive wear and a shock absorber linkage, pin or bush, and the bounce test, negligible damping effect, and any leakage serious enough to indicate that the fluid seal of a shock absorber has failed.
But there can be slight seepage from them, can't there?
Yes, they can, and that's not a reason for rejection.
So are we going under this vehicle or what?
Don't rush me, Robert. I am an engineer. This vehicle's got McPherson strut suspension, as in diagram 4 in the manual, and it's one of the more common suspensions you'll find on vehicles these days. Right, Robert, I've got this little video probe so we can get right in there to the suspension components. But before we start looking at components, I need to make a point about corrosion and prescribed area.
And of course, we both covered this topic in a previous film.
Yeah, we did. So rather than describe it all again, I'd just like to remind everybody that those checks can be found on the back catalogue DVD under the body and structure section.
Great.
Right. First, I want to talk about checks that are on all vehicles. Yeah. So they would need to check if there's enough clearance between axle or suspension unit with the bump stops or chassis. Also, they need to check that there is no suspension unit so weak that it cannot keep the body far enough away from the road wheels.
If the bump stop's missing, is that a reason for rejection?
No, it's not.
So what are the criteria for rejection, Tom?
Well, rather than keep repeat myself, so to speak, all suspension components and their fittings, and that includes McPherson strut casings, they'll be fouled for cracks and or fractures. The exceptions to this are shock absorbers, drive shafts, and fluid gas or their suspension units.
Is that all?
No. Any leaf spring repaired by welding, any coil spring or torsion bar repaired by welding, or damaged by excessive heat, they both fail.
So it isn't a case of every reason for rejection applying to every component?
Exactly. Another example, any suspension retaining or locking device missing, ineffective or not properly locked. And the same goes for any linkage pins on upper and lower suspension arms, wishbones, trailing radius arms, tie bars and rods, panhard rods, torque reaction arms. There's anti-roll bars and linkages. And last but not least, subframes.
And when you say retaining, you mean any bolt, nut, weld, rivet, etc.?
I do, and when I'm talking about locking devices, I'm talking about split pins, shake-proof washers, locking compounds, and so on.
Now, Tom, I think we've said this before, but it's not always possible to determine the effectiveness of some types of locking devices, for example, self-locking nuts. Only the presence of these devices is a test requirement, isn't it?
That's exactly it. So if using the methods of inspection, the test is satisfied that it's there, then it passes. Oh, one other thing. If you hear me say loose, that means there must be relative movement between the components.
Gotcha. And on this vehicle, you've got a coil spring to check.
Yeah, and apart from the things I've already mentioned, we'd be looking at the general condition and location of the spring. So the reasons for failure are worn or corroded so that its cross-sectional area is reduced, making it seriously weakened, a spring not correctly located, a spring mounting, seriously weakened by damage or corrosion.
And security of all the rods, arms and linkages that you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, and also if they're severely distorted, seriously weakened by corrosion or wear, if they're adjustable and they're loose in the threads or the locking device is missing or insecure, seriously weakened by deliberate modification, an anti-roll bar not fitted where it's a standard fitting, inadequate repairs, and the fail criteria for those repairs are in Appendix C, by the way.
Some vehicles use comparatively thin gauge steel pressings on some highly stressed suspension components, don't they?
They do, and some of them have hollow box sections or up-facing areas where dirt impregnated with salt or other chemicals can collect and cause serious but often very local corrosion. Now, these need special attention because the fail criteria for highly stressed components is not the same as prescribed area. And once again, the guidance for this is in Appendix C.
Presumably different components have different fittings.
Yes, and they need to be looked at too. So pins and bushes, we check them for play. And there are some specific dimensions in the reasons for rejection in the inspection manual. We also check suspension ball joints for excessive play, suspension locating pins for incorrectly positioned or insecure.
And I take it you can use the pinch bar to check these items?
You can, but you must take care not to cause any damage.
And some rubber bushes are designed to have a fair bit of movement, aren't they?
They are, and they should normally only be rejected if there's serious deterioration of the bonded or flexible material evident.
Now, all those types of rods and arms that you spoke of have attachment brackets and mountings. What do you check them for?
Apart from what I've already mentioned, we're going to check them for security, damaged, corrosion or wear to such an extent that their strength is seriously reduced, once again, inadequately repaired, or a component seriously weakened as a result of deliberate modification. Earlier on I mentioned about the little probe, video probe, so if I get that and we start looking at some of the components that we've been talking about, and you've got a little screen there, you can see it there, yeah?
Yep.
So if we're looking right up in here, and you can see where the spring's located, the McPherson strut and casing, and that's an up-facing area where impregnated dirt can get. Yeah? And as you come down, you can see here the bolts that attach the hub to the McPherson strut. Can you see that?
Yeah, I can.
There's the retaining bolts and their locking devices. And then you come on down here and you can see there's the ball joint and its retaining devices. And then the bottom wishbone arm, which is one of those highly stressed components that we've just discussed. And then up in here, you can just about see the locations of the wishbone arm. Can you see that? That's got those flexible mountings we talked about. And then if you look just around there, there's the mounting for the anti-roll bar. I'll just see if I can pick up. Yeah, there's the other end of the anti-roll bar, and there's the link up onto the suspension. You see that?
Yeah, just on the right-hand side.
Going right back up the McPherson strut again. So a lot of the things we've been talking about.
Rare, I know, Tom, but what if the drive shaft forms part of the suspension?
That's a very good point, and not as rare as you might think. These types can be found on the rear suspension of some Jags, for instance. Now, in this case, the drive shaft would be a suspension component, and we would check the drive shaft for distortion, damage or serious corrosion, the UJ bearings for excessive play, the flanges and bolts for presence and security. And normally we do these checks when the vehicle is jacked because it's much easier. But I'd like to come back to this vehicle. Now, at the moment we've got this jacked, and that was for the purposes of the discussion we've had and the filming we've been doing. Now, I need to make the point that it's vital that suspension is jacked correctly. And the diagrams in the manual show us where to jack for the various types of suspension, and I'll talk more about that later. Now, this is a McPherson strut, so the jacking point is here to allow the wheels to hang freely. And while the vehicle is being jacked, you should check the movement of components. Now, on this vehicle, you'll be checking the suspension ball joint, tie bar joints, and McPherson strut suspension upper attachment.
And that's diagram 4 in the manual, isn't it, Tom?
Oh, dead right, Robert, yeah. Now, you would jack in the same way and do similar checks for suspension types 3. That would be like Mini or Metro, for example, yeah? And also for suspension types 3A, some Renaults spring to mind.
Very droll, Tom.
Okay, and what we need to do is get out from under this vehicle because we're going to do some checks from the outside.
Okay.
Yep. For these checks, I'm going to use a heel bar. Yeah, and that just means this is a lever that I can push downwards and it raises the road wheel upwards. Yeah, so I just place it under there. Now for suspension types 3, 3A and 4, you know, while I'm levering it upwards like this, yeah, I'm going to check for play in suspension ball joints, tie bar joints, and McPherson strut upper attachments. Yeah. Then I'm going to get hold of the wheel and rock it by hand, or I can use a lever bar in the wheel to rock it if it's appropriate. I tend not to put my hands right under the wheel. I'll just rock the wheel like so, yeah, and also check for any movement in suspension components.
What about other types of suspension?
Same methods of inspection are used, it's just we check different items. So for example, figure 1, which is beam axle, I'm going to check for excessive vertical movement between the stub axle and the axle beam. This is usually referred to as lift. So for suspension types 2, which are parallel wishbones, for example, or 2A, which are torsion bars, I'm going to check for vertical movement between the swivel and housing and movement in the wishbone bearings.
Are those jacked the same way?
No, for the types in figures 1, 2 and 2A, the suspension's not allowed to hang freely. So the jacks are placed under the suspension, it's supported as the vehicle's raised, so that all the components are kept away from their stops, and there's no load imposed on any of the joints.
Wouldn't the wheel play detectors do all this for you?
Not really, you can check most things, but for example, you can't check roughness in the wheel bearing. So let me demonstrate those wheel bearing checks, and when you do this, the ignition needs to be switched off. Yeah. So just check for play, and then rotate the wheel, feeling for roughness in the bearing, and then rotate it and listen to a noise indicating roughness in the bearing. And you'll carry out these checks on all the wheel bearings. The only time you won't check for roughness in the wheel bearing is if the characteristics of the vehicle don't allow it.
Now, Tom, I couldn't help noticing that you can't see all those components.
It was that obvious, was it? Okay, yeah, that's a really good point, because as the assistant, you're now going to carry out those methods of inspection, and I'm going to go around there and have a look. And that way, I've got to feel it, and I get to see it. Yeah? So we swap places, and you grab that heel bar. Yeah, just place it under the wheel. And start to lever it up. I'm going to duck under here, and I'll use this little device again, little probe. Yeah, and we can see suspension ball joint. Yeah. Inner wishbone joints. And then I can look right up in here, and I can see the McPherson strut upper attachment. Yeah. Give it a bit more. Yeah. That's grand. Okay. Now then, if you want to grab the wheel, because you're going to rock the wheel now. And just try and get it just down here, but not right underneath, and just rock the wheel. Same checks again. So I'm looking at all the suspension component joints this time. Okay, that's that. Right, now we move on to the next bit.
And do you look at the front drive shafts?
Yes, we do. And when we're carrying out those checks, what we do is we move the road wheel around onto lock, like that. Yeah. And then we rotate the wheel as we carry out the checks. I'll tell you what, you know what we're looking for, because we've discussed that from the manual. Yeah? So if you call it out, and I'll use this little video probe, and so we can film the different components as you describe them.
Yeah, okay. The first is outer constant velocity joint gaiters missing, split, or insecurely mounted to their housing.
Okay. So that's the outer constant velocity joint gaiter. Checking for splits, checking the security, and checking whether it's secure to the housing. All right.
Drive shaft constant velocity joints excessively worn or insecure.
Okay. Well, that's the same joint that we're talking about. So we rotate that for any problems with it. Yeah.
Drive shaft couplings excessively worn or insecure.
Okay. Get the camera on that one. So that's that there on film. Yeah. Okay.
Drive shaft flexible rubber or fabric coupling units, severely cracked or breaking up.
Yeah.
Softened by oil contamination.
Yeah.
Insecure, or fouling any other parts of the vehicle.
Right, now those are the kind of components that are fitted, say, to the earlier Minis, or there used to be a vehicle Triumph Toledo. So those reasons for rejection relate to those earlier type of vehicles.
And the drive shaft itself?
That's a good point, and I would have got there eventually. Yeah, so we're going to check the drive shafts, if they're bent or damaged. Yeah, so just see the drive shaft there as we rotate it.
Yeah.
And the continuation of the drive shaft under here. And we're also checking insecure or fractured fasteners securing a drive shaft coupling bearing. That's that there. Right. And then what I'd do, I'd move the wheel round to the other lock. And then I'd look in from that direction with the lamp, and I'd check all those same components again to make sure that I'd carried out all those checks. And that's it.
Great.
And then the next stage is we're going to drop the wheels onto the turn plates, and the turn plates will be free moving so that the wheel can be moved from lock to lock, and they're bearing the weight of the vehicle. Now, when you carry out this process where you drop onto the turn plates, it's very important to get the plates set up in the correct position. I've seen many testers dropping them down onto the turn plates, and as the vehicle lowers and the track expands, it forces the plate right up to the maximum position, and then the plates aren't free moving. Yeah? So we'll make sure we get the plates set up before we do that.
Okay.
So now we've got the wheel resting on that free moving turn plate, and it's bearing the weight of the vehicle. And this is the hard bit. I'm going to grab the top of the wheel, yeah, and just push it and rock it straight in and out. Yeah? And I'll be checking suspension components. Right? See it moving on the turn plate now. And then I'll grasp the wheel at 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock, and shake it vigorously. Once again, checking suspension components. You got that?
Yep.
Now, as we discussed before, I can't see very much. You know? But I have carried out the checks and I've felt, if there was anything to feel, I would have felt it. Now, as the assistant, you're going to do that same work again. and then I can look at the suspension components. And what I will do while we carry that out is I'll use that little video probe and see if we can film them.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
All right. Okay, let's see how we get on. So if you grasp at the top and start shaking it in and out, and I'm checking the suspension ball joint. Yeah. I'm checking that locking nut up there to make sure that's secure and in position. I'm checking the suspension inner wishbone joints. And then I can come up here, I can check the McPherson strut, upper gland there, upper attachment, and for any roughness in that upper bearing. Okay, let me stop there.
I need a rest.
It's not easy and it's a lot to check. Okay, so have a little breather for a moment, because then you're going to have to grab it at 9 o'clock, 3 o'clock and do the other checks.
Okay. All right, let's do that.
All right. So away you go. Start shaking it in and out, and I'm going to check for, once again, excessive play in the outer ball joints. Yep, keep that, and I'm going to check those inner track control arm or wishbone bushes once again, looking at those. Looking for serious deterioration between the bonding of the rubber and the metal of that, and those flexible materials. And once again, we're going back up to the McPherson strut, upper support bearing. So we're carrying out very similar checks. Are you all right there, Robert?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll let you stop now, because the beads of sweat are on your brow. Well done.
It's not easy being an assistant, is it?
No, it isn't easy at all. But don't forget, if you weren't filming this, you wouldn't have been shaking it for anywhere near.
And thank goodness the ATL does the shaking bit.
Ah, yeah, but the test has still got to check for condition of the suspension components.
Okay, so it's rear suspension next.
Yes, it is. And when we jack the rear suspension, ideally we should hang that suspension, yeah? And then we've already discussed the wheel bearing checks that would be carried out. And while the suspension's hanging free, all the other suspension components around it, there's an opportunity then to check them for their conditions, security and so on, all the things we've discussed.
Tom, so far you've mentioned in detail the checks on coil springs. What about other types?
Fair enough. Let's talk about leaf springs. They're not so common these days, although there's still quite a few of them around, particularly on light goods vehicles. And we'll start by talking about the condition of the springs, yeah? So, a leaf which is permanently distorted due to damage or so deteriorated that it's seriously weakened or has a defective spring eye. The leaves of a multi-leaf spring displayed to such an extent that the action of the spring is impaired or will foul other parts of the vehicle. The leaves for longitudinal displacement. A spring fitted so as the axle is misaligned.
And for security?
Okay, check the security and whether there's excessive play at the spring anchor and shackle bracket pins and bushes, and check for deterioration of a rubber bush resulting in excessive movement.
What do you mean when you say excessive?
All right, the manual deals with this in different ways, so let me give you some examples. We mentioned earlier on, sometimes it gives you specific dimensions. So it says in the manual that side play at a spring eye mustn't exceed 6 millimetre. Another example, when it talks about play in wheel bearings. For front wheel bearings, it says excessive play. For rear wheel bearings, it says excessive play indicating severe maladjustment or wear.
Okay, any more while you're at it?
Yep. When it talks about beam axles and kingpins, it says a kingpin loose in the beam axle or its pin retaining device missing. When it refers to wearing kingpins, and that includes the bushes, it's got to be so bad that it's likely to adversely affect the steering of the vehicle.
And that's why you need experienced people testing and not just any old Tom, Dick or Harry.
Yeah, I prefer Rob, Dick or Harry and less of the old, if that's all right. Now we need to talk about the anchor and shackle brackets. They'll fail if they're loose to the chassis or if there's a retaining device missing. When a modified bracket's fitted, there may be more holes in the bracket than in the chassis, and this isn't a reason for ejection. Damaged or corroded so that it's seriously weakened. A spring saddle is loose to the spring. A nut or bolt securing the spring to the axle is not secure or is missing.
What else have we got?
Like there's torsion bars, and they'll fail if they're corroded or pitted so that the thickness of the bar is reduced and seriously weakened. There's insecurity or play at an end fixing. The adjustment assembly is inadequately locked. an attachment bracket is loose, or if it's seriously weakened by damage or corrosion.
And that just leaves bonded fluid, gas and air types in my calculations.
Is that all? Well, might as well start with bonded then. Failures on this type are if an attachment is loose or seriously weakened by damage or corrosion, if there's failure of the bonding between rubber and metal so that part of the unit is likely to become displaced. It's a good word, likely. It kind of means you're expecting it to happen. It also fails if it no longer functions due to damage or deterioration.
Okay, fluid, gas and air systems?
Right, if I discuss the different components one at a time, it should be easier. So units or accumulators fail if they're displaced or totally deflated. Damaged or deteriorated, so it's likely to fail. Fouled by moving parts, likely to cause damage or restrict travel. There's leaks. It fails if there's a leak anywhere in the system. Then there's pipe work. Supply or interconnecting pipes so damaged or corroded that they're seriously weakened or they're insecure. Levelling valves fail if they're insecure. And finally, movement. So when you're doing the bounce check on each corner, if there's no suspension movement at all, it fails.
Any issues that we've not dealt with, Tom?
Oh yeah, there's a couple of things we need to talk about. There's a type of suspension that's not obviously represented in the diagrams in the inspection manual. And although it looks similar to McPherson strut, it isn't McPherson strut. It's actually the same principle as diagram 2. And by that, I mean the spring load is imposed on the lower arm. So we need to jack it under the suspension, and care should be taken not to cause any damage doing this. And I have to say, there's a lot of vehicles about, made by different manufacturers with this type of suspension. Even brand new vehicles have got it.
And on some vehicles, the springs need to locate properly when it's lowered, don't they?
Yeah, and you need to take care when you're jacking vehicles with shortened or lowered springs. Provided the spring ends locate correctly without assistance when the vehicle is lowered into the normal running position, this is not a reason for rejection.
And other vehicles have play in the upper support bearing, don't they?
Oh, for example, like the Ford KA upper strut attachment, yeah. They're designed to locate in the body as the suspension is lowered. And when they're hanging, they can have as much as 10mm vertical play or 6mm lateral play. The components of a vehicle steering system are safety critical, and during cornering, they can be under enormous stress.
Just like the suspension.
Exactly, Robert, and it'd be impossible to talk about steering without reference to suspension. Although today we're just going to look at the checks on steering, but we won't ignore suspension where it's relevant.
And during the suspension checks, you obviously look at steering.
You do. When the vehicle's correctly jacked, there's an opportunity to get a better view of steering components, although for the purposes of the film, we won't be jacking today.
Okay, shall we get going?
Oh, hold on a minute. Before we start, we need to think about equipment. So you need a pit or hoist with free moving turn plates, an inspection lamp. You may even need to use the corrosion assessment tool.
And on that subject of equipment, doesn't an automated test lane actually test the steering for you?
The automated test lane shakes the steering, it's true. But you still need to do all of the checks that I'm going to show you.
And do we need an assistant, Tom?
Well, this is ATL that we've got here, but we're going to use it in manual mode. So yes, we'll need to use an assistant to rock the steering under load.
Okay, where do we start?
We start at the steering wheel. And the steering column if it can be seen from inside the vehicle.
Very logical.
Right, before we start this inspection, we need to make sure that any mechanism for adjusting the steering column is fully locked. And then we examine the strength and condition of the steering wheel. Now, we apply a force that's reasonable. You need to bear in mind that some steering columns are collapsible.
And what are the reasons for rejection here?
We fail the steering wheel if it's weakened by modification, any fractures, in a condition that hampers proper control, or is likely to injure the driver's hands.
So any cracks or incompleteness in the covering skin of the wheel or hub, for example?
No, minor cracks that don't weaken the wheel, hamper control, not likely to injure the driver. These are not reasons for rejection.
And I assume that there are different reasons for rejection if the vehicle has handlebars, like some trikes and quads.
Oh, yes, there are, yeah. Vehicles of this type, the reasons for rejection are handlebar or fork yoke, deformed, fractured, cracked, excessively corroded, clamps not tight, any bolt loose or missing. And if the handlebar's got flexible mountings, they fail if they're excessively deteriorated.
And what about hand grips? Are they testable?
Yeah, they certainly are, Robert. They fail if they're missing or not secure to the handlebar.
OK, what's next?
Right, I push the steering wheel rim in various directions at right angles to the column, and I'm just applying light pressure
upward and downward.
And this is to check the column?
I'm checking that adjustable steering column will lock in a fixed position. I'm also checking for any movement between the column shaft and the steering wheel. The steering wheel's not loose.
Do you check the steering column bearing?
Yes, and we look for excessive radial movement, that's play, at the top of the steering column, between the column and shaft, indicating a badly worn top bearing. Similarly, on vehicles with motorcycle-derived steering systems, we check for excessive play in the steering head bearings.
And don't some vehicles have flexible top bearings?
They do, and more than average movement is acceptable on these.
And what about the bottom bearing?
The bottom bearing's not testable. Of course, if there's a defect, the presenter really should be advised.
And presumably you also check the column mounting top bracket for security?
You do, and this is best checked from the footwell. Now I'm going to check what's called steering shaft end float. And this means that I simply push and pull the steering wheel in line with the column, like this. Yeah? And I'm looking for any excessive movement at the centre of the steering wheel. Now, certain types of steering column, for example, those that have got flexible couplings and universal joints, may have movement which is not due to excessive wear or deterioration.
Now, for these tests that you've just done, Tom, do the road wheels have to be on firm ground under load?
No, they don't. But for the checks I'm now going to do, they need to be off the turn plates, on firm ground, under load. And I shall be turning the steering wheel clockwise and anti-clockwise. And I'll be checking steering column couplings and clamp bolts for security. And I'll be checking for excessive wear or deterioration in universal joints and flexible couplings.
And can you see all of those from there?
Not always. On most vehicles, you need to carry out these checks under the bonnet or during the under-vehicle examination, and of course you'd make use of assistant as necessary.
And as usual, you'll also be looking at locking devices?
Yeah, but you're not concerned about the type of locking device, just its presence and security. Now, Robert, I'm going to assess free play in the steering system. And so for this, the road wheels need to be off the turn plates, on firm ground, under load, pointing straight ahead, as this vehicle is here.
And what about power steering?
We'll talk more about that later, but if the vehicle's fitted with power steering, then the engine must be running for any checks where the steering's turned. This is a good time to check by feel at the steering wheel that the power steering is actually working. And all I do is just put some load on the steering wheel like that, start the engine, you see the reaction. Now, I get out the vehicle for this check, and I just lightly turn the steering wheel in either direction like that, without moving the road wheel. And I'm assessing the movement at the rim of the steering wheel.
And what are the criteria here then, Tom?
Right, hang on, let me turn the engine off a minute. Right, it's different depending on the type of steering system that's fitted. So, for example, not more than 13mm for rack and pinion steering. And then there's a type of rack and pinion steering that's got several joints between the steering column and the steering rack. And you're allowed up to 48mm movement on these. And that information, that dimension, is actually found in the notes in the reason projection column. And then finally, not more than 75mm for all other types.
That 48mm seems a big tolerance for rack and pinion.
It does, but it's important to remember there can be movement caused by deflection of flexible joints or spring compression and external power steering systems. And the testers mustn't confuse that movement with play caused by maladjustment or wear.
But steering wheels come in all different sizes. I mean, I've seen quite small steering wheels in a Mini, for instance.
Yeah, around about 200mm or something like that, yeah. Well, the dimensions I'm discussing, they're for a standard 380mm diameter steering wheel. The tester has to vary the dimension according to the size of the steering wheel.
So size does matter?
We know it does, Robert. Time to look under the bonnet.
Yes, and let's bring in our assistant, Sean, and take a look at play under load.
Okay, yeah.
So are you going to show me using the video probe?
Well, as I've got it in my hand, I thought I might.
Nice one.
And it's helpful for the film, and you can see the components while I'm talking about them. Yeah. But before I go any further, I need to make a point here. When you're doing the under-bonnet checks, if you have to run the engine, say, for power steering, then be careful of moving parts. Yeah. Now, also, when the steering's being rocked, it's important that it's rocked in both directions, yeah, and the wheels are on hard standing. So if you want to just move over that way a moment. All right then, Sean, if you could make sure the park brake's on, it's out of gear, and start your engine, yeah? All right, that's grand, lovely. OK, if you can rock the steering.
So tell me what you're looking for, Tom.
Well, I'm looking for security of components on the vehicle structure. So, for example, rack and pinion housing, could be a steering box, could be an intermediate drop arm housing. If it were a steering box, I'd be checking for relative movement between the sector shaft, the cross shaft, and the drop arm. This vehicle's got a steering rack. Now, although on this particular one I can't see the actual housing, normally you'd be able to see that, and you'd be able to see if it was moving. Yeah. I'd check down this side, and I'd also do these checks on the other side. But on this particular vehicle, that's as much as you can do, really. OK then, Sean, if you can stop, switch your engine off.
Tom, we've mentioned power steering a number of times. What do we need to check there?
Right, I've just had the engine switched off so you can hear me speaking clearly, but for the checks on the power steering, we would have kept the engine running as we had it and the steering rocked under load and so on.
If it isn't working, does it fail the test?
Oh yeah, if it's inoperative or malfunctioning, that's a reason for ejection.
And generally these systems are hydraulic, so is the tester looking for fluid leaks too?
That's right. The tester needs to be sure that the leak shows that the component, seal or gland has failed, and that the leak is from the power steering and not from some other source. Tester also needs to look to see that the pipes are free from damage and not chafing other parts of the vehicle.
And do you check the pump?
Yeah, where practical, the tester looks to see that it's secure and the drive system is not missing or defective. There are several types of electrically assisted power steering, which must also be checked for correct operation and security of the motor. If such a system has a warning lamp, illumination of the lamp is not, in itself, a reason for ejection. That's as much as we can check under the bonnet. So now we're going to raise the vehicle and go underneath.
OK. OK, Tom, we're underneath the vehicle. What are we looking for and what does it fail on?
Right. Normally, when you ask someone that question, they'll say excessive play in a ball joint. And that's true. But there's many other things. It fails if I've got a loose ball pin shank, track rod or drag link end, if I've got a weak or broken socket spring in a ball joint, excessive play in a pivot point, for example, those intermediate drop arms, and relative movement between a steering arm and its fixing. So there's a lot of things there. Now, this particular vehicle doesn't have all of those components on it. So what we need to do, first of all, we need to get the engine running because it's got power steering, and I'm going to be using my little probe and we'll look at the components and I'll talk about them, yeah?
Great.
So if you just stuck down a bit.
All right, Sean, if you could make sure the park brake's on, out of gear and start your engine, please. OK. And rock the steering. Right, now move the little probe up here and you can see we're looking at where the track rod end is in the steering arm, yeah? The steering arm's part of the hub on this vehicle, and there's the retaining nut at the top. And then as we come down, we're coming down towards the track rod end dust cover. And we'd be looking for looseness in the track rod shank up into the steering arm, yeah? Then we look at the ball joint itself. Is there excessive play or wear in that ball joint? Then as we come round, the track rod end then goes into the track rod. You see that? And that is a locking nut there. Sometimes these are loose, and you can get play where the track rod end goes into the track rod. Now, as we come along, this is going into a steering rack, and on the inner joint in the steering rack, where the track rod goes in, sometimes you get play in that joint or sleeve, and you would see the track rod kicking up and down. This one's okay. You come on round, yeah, and as you get to this point, now there's this steering rack housing, there's a securing bolt. We'd be checking there, we couldn't see that from the top, and they'd be looking for movement there between the rack housing and the vehicle structure, and coming along here, and there's the other fixing just there. Can you see that? And now we can see the steering UJ at the lower part of the steering column where it goes into the steering rack, so we can check that. It's moving, excessive wear or play on that. OK, Sean, that's fine. Thanks very much. Switch the engine off. So there's a lot to look at, even just in that secluded area, and we do the same checks on the near side of the vehicle.
As we can't dismantle, a visual inspection of some components covered by gaiters or dust covers isn't possible, is it?
Correct. And that applies to under trays and so on, you know, where they cannot be readily removed without the use of tools.
And something else, what if the steering joint dust cover is split or missing?
Greater care must be taken when testing joints in these circumstances, and provided there's no failable defect found, then the presenter should be advised about the dust covers.
And ball joints themselves, of course, are designed to have movement. So how does the tester assess excessive play?
That's a good point. As with all components, play or wear should not be regarded as excessive unless it's clear that replacement, repair or adjustment is necessary. Now, testers also need to bear in mind that relative movement due to excessive play or wear must be distinguished from relative movement because there's a built-in clearance or spring loading of a joint.
And you get a similar effect with bonded joints?
Yes, you do, and with these joints, slight deterioration is acceptable.
Now, some vehicles, Tom, have rear wheel steering, and they can have a shaft connecting the front to the rear. So what do you do there?
That's simple. You check for condition and security of the rear wheel steer components, and that includes a connecting shaft. It also includes hydraulics if they're fitted. And the reasons for ejection are the same as for front steer components.
And what if the rear wheel steering was inoperative?
Provided the rear wheels are held substantially in the straight ahead position and the front steering is not adversely affected, then the fact that that system's not working is not a reason for ejection in itself.
Some of these checks can be carried out at the same time as previous ones, can't they?
Quite true. They can also be conducted during the lock-to-lock check, and we'll deal with that in a minute.
So what are we looking for?
A number of things to be considered here. We'll check for sharp or deep grooves in the neck of a ball pin, track rod, drag link ends seriously misaligned, any component fractured, cracked, damaged, excessively corroded or deformed so that it's unserviceable, structural repairs by welding or signs of excessive heat having been applied. All reasons for rejection.
OK, let me hold you there. Do all of these checks apply to rear wheel steering components?
Yes, they do, and that holds true for all the checks in this section.
And I assume you also check all the various retaining and locking devices for presence and security?
You do. Any retaining or locking device missing or insecure constitutes a failure. However, some types of locking device are not obvious. And with these types, if the tester sees signs of it having been disturbed, the presenter should be advised.
And what about steering dampers?
If a steering damper is leaking, the tester needs to decide if the leakage is so bad it's clear the seal or gland has failed. Vehicles with motorcycle-derived steering systems have got additional reasons for ejection for steering dampers: insecure, ineffective, or impairs steering action.
And I guess corrosion must be an issue here too.
It is, and we look for all the usual suspects in prescribed areas, as is covered in the back catalogue DVD in the body structure section. There's also more advice in Appendix C in the inspection manual. Now, let's move this vehicle onto the turn plates and let's have a look at lock-to-lock checks, OK?
OK.
Right, here we are, back under the vehicle for lock-to-lock checks.
Yep. Do these checks apply to all suspension types, Tom?
They do, but vehicles with beam axles can alternatively be raised, as in Figure 1 in the suspension types diagrams. And then these inspections can be carried out at the same time as the checks for the subsection for front suspension. On a slightly different note, there's a couple of additional reasons for ejection for vehicles with motorcycle-derived steering systems.
OK, we'll come to them in a minute.
Right.
This vehicle has got power steering, so we need the engine running and the turn plates to move freely, yeah?
Yeah, and I'd also have the park brake applied or the rear wheels chocked fore and aft. That's on health and safety grounds, really. I don't want this vehicle moving backwards and forwards when I'm on either full lock. I'm going to be using my little probe again so that we can look at some of these components. And I like doing that anyway, I've got used to it now. So if you just duck down, Sean, can you make sure the park brake's on, add a gear and start your engine, please? Lovely. OK. Right, Sean, slowly turn the steering over onto full left-hand lock. And as he's doing this, I'm looking to check for any fouling of steering components. Yeah. Fine in there. And then I'll look for any fouling of the tyre
or the road wheel. And all these are with any part of the vehicle. Steering component, tyre, road wheel, any part of the vehicle. Okay, see that? We're fine up there. And now for brake pipes and hoses, I'm going to check whether they're stretched, twisted, or seriously damaged. That one looks fine there. I'm going to check for the security and adjustment of steering lock stops, and this hasn't got any external steering lock stops. Then I'm going to check the steering rack gaiter. Check that for insecurity or splits, or if it's missing. You just see that there?
Yep.
Yeah. I'll come around this side with it so you get another look at it. Yeah. And the tester should expand this so they can get a real good look and make a proper examination of it. Yeah. See that? Get right in there and have a real good look at it. Okay then, Sean, slowly turn the steering on full right-hand lock. Checking again. Moving any steering component, tyre, road wheel, etc. Fouling any part of the vehicle. Look at the brake hose again, do those same checks, yeah? All right then, Sean, straighten it up, please. And switch your engine off. Thanks very much. And then, of course, I do those checks, all repeated again on the near side wheel.
How does the tester assess tightness or roughness?
That's a very good point. And it's important that the tester also turns the steering from lock to lock using the steering wheel to make a proper assessment of that.
Okay, and you mentioned security and adjustment of lock stops. Some vehicles have lock stops where the front tyres actually rub against soft metal pads on the body.
Oh, you mean, for example, like on the Morgan?
Yeah, exactly. What about them?
Oh, they're acceptable, provided they're properly maintained so that they don't damage the tyres.
All right, and finally, you mentioned some additional reasons for rejection of motorcycle-derived steering.
Oh, yeah, we did. We said we'd come back to that, yeah. Right, the reasons for rejection are any fouling or restriction of the free movement of the steering from lock to lock, handlebar grips or handlebar mounted controls that have no clearance with any part of the vehicle when it's on either full lock.
Okay, great, yeah.
You know the good thing about doing steering, suspension and corrosion?
No, what's that?
No dates.
You're right. Fancy a lift home?
Yeah, I don't mind if I do.
Shall we let Sean out?
Nah, leave him in there.